All right, so let's get started. So today we will be focusing on, we'll continue with our OO design that we had last, like 2 sessions ago. Just got the markers. So before we get started, just a quick show of hands. How many of you here for the first time? We have a few folks, all right. So welcome to the group. Just a very quick background is we've been doing this now for 8+ years at this point of time, and we've been trying to meet every week. So far, we've been, at least the last year, we've been reasonably successful trying to keep the weekly cadence. This group is super effective and super helpful if you have prepped for the sessions and whatnot. So one of the things that we have started doing is pretty much weeks in advance, we're trying to plan what we will do. And the goal for the 2 classes before was to do this object-oriented thing in full detail, but unfortunately we couldn't get through that. So we shifted the classes down a little. So the intent is still preserved while we kind of failed in our objective to keep the schedule constant. But anyway, so that's where we are. So before I move further, how many of you have actually prepared for the questions that we had planned for today? Do we know what questions we had planned? Go ahead.
Chat server.
Parking lot.
Minesweeper.
Minesweeper. That's it, right? So we will. So the way I'm focusing on is I'm going to probably take about 1.5 hours for the first one, which is we'll go through the chat server in reasonable amount of detail, and then we will try to apply some of the principles and the questioning, the techniques that we use there into parking lot and Minesweeper, and try to go on with it. I will cover parking lot in super brief because parking lot is like an overabused question. You'll probably see that everywhere. There's enough like YouTube videos around it, so there's not really a whole lot of value in covering that. That's my belief. But we'll definitely spend a little bit more time on Minesweeper because it actually opens up a class of problems that are interesting to solve. All right. So before we jump into answering object-oriented interview questions, I wanted to actually take a few minutes, about 5, maybe 10 minutes, just walking through a general interview communication protocol. And then we'll see what are the different steps. So I'm trying to crowdsource this information from you. What do you think we should do in an interview? So an interviewer walks up to you and says like, hey, my name is whatever, and nice to meet you. Let's actually walk through an interview question. And then the interview question is something like, I'd like you to design a chat server for me. Or it will be something to the effect of like, reverse a linked list, or whatever that is, right? It could be a technical interview question, it could be a object-oriented question, or system design question, or it could even be, tell me about a very successful, deliverable that you've had in the last year or last 2 years. Like, what have you done, or something like that, right? So those are some of the type of questions. So what's the first thing? What do you do? What would you do if someone actually asks that? Like, let's start with a design question. Let's say I don't want to use chat server because I want to use that for the rest of it, but let's do parking lot, right? If I were to say, all right, let's design a parking lot. So what's the first thing that you want to do?
You want to ask more questions and clarify problems.
Okay. So first step is essentially ask clarifying questions. What is the goal of this?
To define the scope and understand what the is looking for.
To define the scope and
Understand what, like which direction the interview might be interested in.
fair enough. Let me rephrase that in a different way. So the objective of asking clarifying questions is essentially you want to make sure that there's meeting of minds. So you understand what the requirements are, like you understand what are you trying to do, right? What is the solution that you're trying to provide, and clearly you want to articulate what is your input, what is your output. Like in a technical coding question, you're saying, so you want me to reverse the string, which means if I get string foo, I'm supposed to return OOF or whatever that is, right? So you would want to talk through not the algorithm, not how you do it, but essentially what is expected of you from what comes to you as input, what goes out as output, and some basic elements of what the behavior should be. So in this particular scenario, if it's chat server, parking lot, or Minesweeper, we'll talk about what is it that you want. Like, you want a system design, do you want an OO design, do you want an object model, do you want a class model? Like, what is the output that you want from the interview? is something that you're trying to get in the clarifications. That is the first step. First step is to make sure that you and the interviewer are actually talking the same language, you're actually trying to figure out the same thing. Because if the interviewer is actually looking for a system design and you walk in with an object-oriented design, I think there's going to be a terrible fit. A chat server can be a design question which is used for system design, or it can be used for over design. Here we will use it for over design, and it's very easy for you to actually make that, think about it as when someone says design a chat server, you might just go walk into actually designing this multi-threaded, super low latency chat server something, and that may not really be what the interviewer is looking for. So that's the clarifying question. That is number one. And number two is, again, there is a little bit of theatrics here. You want to communicate to the interviewer that you are in the business of actually, when in real life, when someone actually gives you a problem statement, you're just not running with it, but you would actually take a minute, pause, understand the objective, what are we trying to do, and what is the goal, why are we trying to accomplish it, and you're actually taking that step back, because communication is pretty imprecise. So what is in my head is not something I can actually communicate to you if I actually say it's a requirement. So in many cases, you've actually seen requirements actually come down as requirements are just requirements. They are not the actual. They are actually needs more than the requirements. Right? There's a difference between what is a customer need and there's a difference between what is a customer requirement. And the customer need could be to actually have an easy way of doing something, and the customer requirement might be to say, I want you to do this for me. There might be a better solution which might actually satisfy the need, which is not necessarily what they are saying. So it's always a good practice to ask, why you're doing it, what is the objective. So in this, in an interview setting, it's a little different, but in a typical conversation, right, what are we trying to achieve? What's our goal? If our in an interview setting, unfortunately, the interviewers might come up with a contrived example with restrictions and whatnot that forces you to think of a specific algorithm, which is fine. But in a real world problem space, you are always looking for ways to solve a problem, and not necessarily, you're not looking to solve the problem statement. You're expected to solve the problem, which is the root cause, right? So that's what you're trying to do. Now, that's what the clarifying questions mean. That means that the intent of actually doing that is to explain to the interviewer that I'm thinking about it, I have the logical thought process, I know how to ask questions to get the kind of data I need, and move on. Can we go overboard with clarifying questions? Is it possible to go overboard with asking the clarifications?
Yes.
Of course, right? You can always ask questions. I can spend the entire 45 minutes, 1 hour asking questions, and you will probably quickly sense it in the interview. Come on, I asked you a question, go, run with it, right? What's the alternative to asking clarifying questions?
Assumptions.
Making assumptions and clearly stating them, and letting the interviewer actually disagree with you or change the assumptions. Like, I'm going to make an assumption that this is how it's going to work, and the interviewer might say, no, that's not how it's going to work, because you have to do something else, or you have to handle something, or something like that. So you always balance this clarifications with assumptions, and there's a thin line to walk. It's very hard to get it right. There is nothing wrong in getting it wrong. As in, if you go a little overboard with questions, that's fine. If you go a little overboard with assumptions, that's fine. But it's exactly what you're trying to. Your goal there is just to kind of communicate to the interviewer that, hey, I am thinking about this question. I have a logical thought process, and I am making rational assumptions. This is a lot more valuable for questions which are design and object oriented or system designed in nature, primarily because these questions are more vague, and there's a lot more ambiguity, which is by default injected into it. Questions such as reversing a linked list, there is not really a whole lot of clarifying questions that you need to make. You could actually walk in and saying, I'm going to make an assumption this is a singly linked list, because doubly linked list reversing is stupid, it doesn't make any sense. So just start from the other end and you're good, right? So you could do some of those things are more assumptions than clarifications. Right? So what next? Done. So now we're done with clarifying questions. Now what's the next thing?
It depends on what type of design or what type of question we're talking about.
Mm-hmm. So I call it the classification step, but it could be anything else. So it could be in your mind you could have it as anything else. But the classification step is that very quickly you need to take the question and start classifying it into questions that you've already worked on, that you already know of. Like if I were to ask you a question which is essentially design a game of poker, you need to be able to say, okay, you know what, I just did design a parking lot, design a blackjack a couple of weeks ago. So that's kind of how this is. I'm going to model this on that. So what you're asking me to do is to design a card game, which is essentially with some rules and whatnot. So trying to classify the type of system, trying to map it to something you already know is one of the ways of doing it. A few things that will help you do that faster is also to kind of think of the system in a more abstract sense, right? Are you trying to, is it a real-time processing system, or is it a batch processing system? Is it transactional in nature? Is it things like, an elevator system is an example of where it's continuous input, immediate processing, continuous output. Whereas if you look at like a chat server, for example, is message coming in from multiple places, message going out to multiple places. If you think of things like payroll processing or airline ticket reservation, there's like a combination of immediate transactional nature, and there's some batch processing that also happens on the side. So net step 2 is essentially to have a way of classifying, because this generally sets up your game plan of how you're trying to solve the rest of the questions. So what's next? So now that you have classified this, let's assume it's a parking lot. So you have figured this out as more as a transactional system, which is trying to check customers in and out, and then figure out how to bill them for the duration that they have. So you figure that out. So that's like a very high level. You know that this looks like a transactional system. You classified it. You probably know like a parking lot is probably no different from a hotel reservation to some extent. It's no different from an airline ticket booking. They're all like similar classes of problems. There's some minor changes here and there, but sure. Done. Now I'm done with the classification. So what next?
Interface. Define the objects.
So say one more time. Interface.
So yeah,
APIs.
define the core object.
Define objects, entities. So fantastic, right? So there's a slight difference in two different like groups of thought. One is essentially to identify the objects, entities. Like what are the different, who are all the players here in this game? And the second one is actually to talk about the behavior, interfaces and whatnot. So what would go first, logically? And there's nothing wrong with doing one or the other, because in the case of when you're defining entities, you are thinking about the behavior and saying, okay, who's going to make the behavior? This guy and this guy and this thing and that thing, right? So you are thinking about the behavior and the objects together. But what are you listing out first is pretty much the question. When you're thinking about the activities or actions or behavior, you are doing the same thing, saying, oh, I need to have like a parking lot manager, and the manager needs to do the following functions. So you will be thinking of both of them together. It's never in isolation. But what comes first? I cannot
Actors will come first, and once we have the actors, then we think about the relations between those actors, how they react.
So the problem with doing it behavior style is that the behavior is actually a lot more widespread, and more in behaviors and less in actors. So it's a lot easier to do entities, and even if you make a mistake and you have like I have a parking lot controller class, and you also have I have a billing system, right? And then you come back and say, you know what, the parking lot and the billing system can be the same thing. So I don't need two actors. You can do actors merging, and then you can deal with that. But if you go down the path of actually trying to figure out this behavior is done by this behavior, this behavior, this behavior, you have like hundreds of behaviors, and now you need to find a way to merge them. So the complexity is a lot more. So I would prefer to do essentially the actors first. Actors or entities. Okay? In a typical design question, that's what it is. Now, let me use the process of design question here, because that's what we're going to do. But you can also imagine a similar process for like a regular coding interview question as well. You are trying to think about the API, the signature, and things like that. So at that particular point of time, it's not really actor, because what you're modeling is actually a process, right? A functionality. So that's what that is. What's this actually a 2.5, but we'll come back to that afterwards. So what else? So we're done with actors. What's next?
Behaviors.
Then you model the behaviors. Okay? And behaviors, APIs, interactions between the entities and whatnot, and finally, or how you bringing it all together, right? That's what the design is.
Yeah.
So you will essentially produce whatever your output is.
Yeah.
So if your output is sequence diagrams,
Yeah.
the behavior and the actors get into it. If your output is a class model, then you're talking about just individual objects and then the interactions between them. The actual entity modeling will include the data that you have in that. So the data entities and all the fields, the properties and attributes and things like that. So that's good. Now, what was 2.5 was essentially, so one of the things that is actually, that has historically served me well in most of these conversations and questions is to actually keep the end objective in mind, not the end objective of the interview, but the end objective of the problem they're trying to solve. If my goal is essentially to build a parking lot system, then my goal is not to build a parking lot system. My goal is actually to enable customers to use a parking lot system to do something. So it's almost always like a customer-driven behavior, which is what we want to affect. The system is there to fulfill a specific need. So the building of the system is not the objective, but the actual need of the customer that we're trying to solve is the need. So I usually want to put a 2.5, which is sort of like do a needs mapping of sort. Like what is the actual need? What are we trying to solve for? We kind of talked about that in the clarifying question as well. So once you clarify, classify, get to the needs and succinctly articulate what that need is. If you do that, that will actually help you immensely in your actors and whatnot, because any actor that is irrelevant to the need can be completely ignored. Like, do you actually need like for a parking lot system, would you need a valet object? I'm like, yeah, possibly, because I may want to do valet parking. That's fine. If that's a part of the core needs, yes. If it's not a part of the core needs, no. Do I need to have a billing system? Like, do we need billing in this system at all? If we need billing, then yes. If not, then no. So it's a lot easier for you to like narrow down your field of view if you have the needs articulated well. So I would go down, list down the needs, like saying what are the requirements of the system, or what's the need, what's the customer need? 1, 2, 3. And typically in an interview, you cannot have any more than like maybe 2 or 3 needs. That's it, because each of the needs are a separate question in of itself, and the interviewer would not want to have 1 need because that becomes a single purpose system. So you'd want to have at least 2 so that you can say that my system can apply to A and B, and then possibly quickly extend it to C. So that's probably how that will actually work out. Okay. Now we talked about actors, we talked about behavior, we talked about output, right? So this is like what is the purpose, right? What's the purpose part? There's a parallel purpose that I have, which is essentially what is our objective in the interview? What do you want to do? My objective in an interview, as an interviewer, what am I trying to find out? As a candidate, what am I trying to communicate? So what do you think would be a fantastic outcome for you as a candidate? If you are a candidate and you are actually trying to answer questions, what do you think would be a good outcome for you? What do you think you want the interviewer to take away? I wrote down my thoughts earlier, so I just wanted to see if I can cheat and use that as is. I can't do this from memory. So I was just thinking about what would be like, what would look like a good output if I were like an interviewer and I'm evaluating and assessing someone. What would I write as excellent feedback for someone, right? So this is what I had, which was essentially saying so number 1 is that I would like to say that you are conversant with OO topics, and you know the OO concepts and you can apply them. Specifically, I'm actually saying listing out what are the 4 core OO things that we captured yesterday. The previous session was essentially abstraction, encapsulation, inheritance, and polymorphism. So I know that I need to say that you know these things very well. And I'll try to post this in the Facebook or in the SDE Skills blog, and I'll link it up. That was number 1 in my mind. For bonus points, if you actually know design patterns, that's bonus. And I would like, which design patterns, are you familiar with the design patterns and whatnot? If you actually throw a name of a design pattern without understanding the details of it, and as an interviewer I poke into it and I figure out that you're weak, that's not going to work in your favor. It may not work negatively, but it won't be positive. But if you were to throw a pattern saying, I'm going to use like a manager pattern or a decorator pattern, and I would like to poke into it and say, why do you think it's decorator? And if you have meaningful, well thought out positioning on why you use a specific thing, then like bonus points, right? But at the end of the day, like number 1 objective is for you to convince the interviewer that you are conversant with OO concepts and OO principles, and that you can quickly apply that to any problem statement that is given to you. So that is number 1. Second item that I would like to say is that you are logical and structured with your problem solving approach, and you can ask insightful questions to make rational assumptions while designing the solution. So looking at the concept of making assumptions and approaching it logically, breaking it down step by step, not jumping across different areas, and solving it in layers in terms of like, solve the ones that make sense for you first, and then further down. Now, bullet point of this is that you can communicate your ideas effectively. So communication skills is absolutely important, not just so you are listening to me, you're actually, when I ask you questions, you're able to clarify. When I ask you or challenge you, you're able to defend. When I challenge you and you're wrong, you're able to examine your convictions and say, look at this and say, actually, you know what, you're right, I didn't think of it that way. Now that you've said this, let me change my design. So being able to adapt and go back and be flexible and change your design would be the thing. And the last one was essentially saying that you approach the problem with the end goal in mind and are able to explore multiple options and innovate if you get stuck. And that would be like you will get stuck in the interview, in the design process, umpteen number of times. I mean, you're going to get stuck no matter what. Unless you have done this before, unless you're just like, repeating this from memory, you will get stuck with new requirements, you will get stuck with something. Even if you don't get stuck, the interviewer will throw some curveballs at you which will make you stop and think. The ability to think on the fly and innovate on your feet is absolutely important. So to me, these are the three things. I didn't write it down, but I will share it later. So looking at convincing people that you have your OOFU in play. So your OOFU is one thing, and then the second element is essentially about problem solving. And the third thing is essentially about innovating, which is around how flexible you are and things like that. Right? So that's kind of what the three key things you want. And you do all the three in an interview, you're golden. I mean, there's absolutely no way you're not going to get, that you will not come out like successful at the end of the interview if you've gotten all the three things knocked out. Right? Right. And sorry?
The one thing I would say is probably the biggest pitfall in design is getting tied up in details.
Mm-hmm.
So I think you probably try to find someone figure out how to get rid of avoid the part of
abstraction, solving it in layers, and do the uber layers first. One of the advantages of object-oriented principles is also the abstraction and the encapsulation. So you can always say, hey, this particular functionality is abstracted out. Somebody else is going to deal with that. I can double click on that and debug that later or get that thing later. So problem solving element is actually not getting stuck in the weeds is important. So one little thing to share, one of the recent interviews that I went in with, I was going through that, and then the interviewer asked a very, very simple question. So we have at Amazon, we have concept of shadowing people for interviews. So somebody else interviews, I'm watching the interview. So I'm not saying a word, just taking notes and whatnot. So this is more as a quality check for us, and it's also like a good way for us to learn from each other. So the interviewer asked a super simple question, and I was like, why are you asking this question? This is like, you Google Amazon interview question, this is probably in the first page. So don't do that. That's what I was thinking. And the candidate actually did a terrible job at the interview and didn't do well. And now I'm thinking, why? What went wrong, right? And few things that came out was, number one was there was no clarifying elements there at all. And I think the candidate actually brilliantly failed almost in every one of these areas in different ways. I mean, they did reasonably okay. Thank you. They did reasonably okay, but they actually brilliantly failed in so many different ways. So why? And the reasons why was clarifying questions, none at all. They just made assumptions and then jumped in, and then those assumptions didn't make sense. Like it's about, so the question had to do with data set from 2 different dates, and then the interviewer made helped the candidate by saying, let's assume you're talking about consecutive dates, and let's make it today and yesterday or something like that. Let's keep it simple. And the candidate made complete assumptions around, built his entire design around today and yesterday to a point where he had functions which said, if date equals today, then do this, else do something else, and that's how they did the processing. It was like assumptions which were made to a large degree of which was like, there are assumptions which are systemic assumptions, there are convenience assumptions, right? I would like to simplify things by making a few assumptions so that I can later make changes to make it better. And the assumptions were terrible in that particular case and not validated. And I was actually questioning why the interviewer did not challenge the assumptions right away, because now you are at the mercy of the interviewer. If you make stupid assumptions, now what might happen is you might actually go ahead with the interview process, you might actually finish coding and delivering everything, and then the interviewer comes back and says like, hey, what about the assumption you did at step 1, that's wrong, now let's fix it. and now you've already spent 35 minutes of your interview. There's no way to go back and do a makeover. So typically what I've seen good interviewers do is to start poking at the assumptions right off the bat and try to correct it and continue further. Now, I don't know what the interviewer was thinking. We haven't had a chance to sync up yet afterwards, but that would be my feedback to the interviewer, saying if I were you, I would probably challenge them then. Because there are certain assumptions that are okay to make and there are certain assumptions that are completely useless. And if you just have like a brain freeze and you did some stupid assumptions, I don't want that to torpedo your entire interview. I mean, you could have been an otherwise good candidate, you just made a stupid assumption at the beginning. I don't want that to actually completely derail your entire conversation. I really want to know, so if I challenge you on your assumptions and you're not able to correct yourself, then it's your own doing. I have done my best and it's all your fault after this. Right? So that's how I was thinking about it. So back to this one. The output was not clear in that particular scenario. Did not know what to expect, did not know what the input was, what the output should be. A lot of other incorrect assumptions all throughout. So, excuse me. So yeah, now moving back to, so that makes sense as a structure, like it's a loose template of how to do it. I want to get a little sort of prescriptive here to go there.
What was that last one?
Innovation, innovating when you're stuck. Problems if you're stuck, which you will be at multiple places. Finding quick solutions, tweaks to what your thing is. Worst case, be prepared to shelve your entire design and start over. For good interviewers, if you actually put like a template design and the interviewer asks you like a fundamental question, don't be married into your solution at that point of time. Right? Be prepared to completely throw what you have away and redo from the beginning. In a different context, if it's towards the later part of the interview as well, you have a solution in mind. For example, one of the classic questions we solved a little while ago was comparing, I think it was this whole like two-sum problem, right? So given an array of numbers, find two numbers that add up to a total. It's a classic two-sum problem. The solution involves like shoving it into a hash map and then dealing with it, and then I can ask you to write the code. You do all of that. Now I say, you know what? You don't have extra memory. Now what do you do? So there's not much you can do. I mean, throw away your solution, start from the scratch, and say now solve the problem in a different way. And let's pretend that you actually did not use extra memory, but you assume that the array was mutable, and you did sorting inline, right? You could do that. Now I'm going to come and say, you know what? You can't. The array is like immutable. Now what? Then that actually now throws you in the thing where you have to go back and say, okay, I have an n-square solution in mind, and that's the only thing you can do. But be willing to go there. And there are a few brain blocks that you might have where I don't want to do this, n-square is a bad idea, I don't want to do this, I want to keep it flexible and all those things, right? Some of these things might actually prevent you from reaching the right solution, because these are heuristics that help you weed out the bad solutions quickly, but then there are reasons when that is the only solution. Then what do? You don't want to stop giving a solution. It's at times when you're stuck, it's better to give an inefficient solution than to actually give no solution at all. So, without going into details of the coding pieces, which we'll do later, let's, I know I took a little longer than I thought, but I thought this would be helpful to walk through. So let's do chat server. So let's do it collaboratively. I have some design concept in mind, but so I will do I'll play the role of the interviewer, and I'm looking at all of you to be collective candidate, and I will jump in with clarifications wherever, and I'll note take as well. Let's try to do it that way. Okay. So the Uber question that's given to you is, I would like you to design a chat server, and the first set of questions that you're trying to ask is clarification questions. But I'm going to actually jump into classification right now, or output right now, is that I'm saying this is an OO question. Let me just give it right off the bat, because there would be an easy confusion, especially on system questions, which are potentially system design questions, because then your clarifying questions will be based on that. Like if you start asking clarifying questions about what's the scale of the system, how many users will be there, what's the concurrency, what's the latency requirement, if you start thinking about those, then you are asking clarifying questions for system design. And what I'm asking you to do is over design. So I don't want you to waste time there. So usually, if my interview question is over design, my goal is to evaluate you on over design, and I'm giving you like an ambiguous question which could be misinterpreted. Or even if it's not an ambiguous question, like design a game of poker, I would actually go and say, I'm looking for over design from you, so why don't you actually apply over principles and help me design like a game of poker. So then we're not talking about like an online multi-server game or where it's still again network, number of concurrent users, and all those things, right? So that's not what we're talking about. We are actually talking about the deck of cards and whatever else that actually goes with it. So OO design is what it is. So let me actually also explain this is OO design, right? All right, so let's go. What are the questions?
What exactly is a chat server?
What exactly is a chat server? So it is chat server is essentially for people who have used IRCs in the past, or people have used any of the messaging service like Facebook Messenger, Yahoo Messenger, WhatsApp, or any Google Hangouts, any of these things. It is essentially facilitating one-on-one chat communication, and it also has like essentially a one-to-many chat communication. Essentially, it's a group chat of where it's n people. Your message goes to every one of them, and everybody's message comes to you. So one producer, multiple subscribers or consumers. So that tends to be a typical model of a chat server. It is generally real time, as in you're expected to. It is expected to be. There's instant messaging essentially more than anything else. So
If user is offline, we just ignore that or say that it is offline, you can't chat, or we save it and then we play when the user comes back. When you say real time.
fantastic question. So the needs are different, but let's assume that so this is near real time. It's not necessarily real time. So you deliver it to the user, and the user can respond when at their own leisure. So there is no concept of online or offline. The user is essentially always there. I mean, it's like an email server too, right? I mean, at the end of the day, it is more like an email. To a large extent, chat is more near real time email with restrictions on the number of characters that you can type or something like that.
So is it one-to-one or one-to-group chat? Like,
So let's actually restrict it to one-to-one for now. I don't want to do the group chat yet, because group chat actually makes it more complicated. But I want the design to be flexible so that I can make it into a group chat anytime you want.
Except to send messages, do we need to consider like a share photos?
Only text. Media, the question was around media types. Photos, videos, and images and icons and whatever else. I actually say just no media types, just text only.
And there's a character limit on the text?
There's a reasonable character limit. Let's say it's 4K or something like that. Nothing fancy. Not Twitter-like. With what, 250 now? 280, right?
Can we assume that we can reload the text after the user log out?
So can we load the text after
After the user log out of the chat server, and when they log back in, can we assume that we can reload the history?
Yes. The question was that will the user be able to see the history of their chats when they come back in? The answer is yes. So think of it more like the way I'm abstracting it is more like an email server or email system, except that it's fewer characters and more real time, because email is generally not really real time. As in, you can have a conversation in emails. I've seen people do that, but not very effective. So here, so essentially, if I log out, I come back, I should be able to see my chat
You said
history.
there was no concept of offline or on.
There is no offline, online concept per se. Let's keep it simple.
So basically, we need to have a storage layer.
You are jumping to here, so I want to stop you. Correct? Good answer, but
that will, I mean, it's like you have to save history, basically.
yes,
Yes.
that is good. That is clarifying the needs at this point. You're still in the needs space. So all the questions that I've heard so far are actually with the intent of identifying the behavior and the actors. That is clear, but we are not mentioning that, and I don't want us to be mentioning that, because let's stay in the space of identifying the problem. So your question was, do we need to store the messages? And the answer is yes. So yes, right? Next.
I have two questions. First question is, what will be the type of authentication for this authenticating the user?
Okay.
The
Next
second
question.
Next question is, do we need to encrypt the text messages across?
So me saying yes or no, how does that alter the design for you? Significant. Like if I were to say that let's do OAuth versus username password versus Facebook login versus something else or whatever, like use a third-party auth provider, use a different auth. How does that change your design for you? Is that not like a one small abstraction? So this is an example, not to pick on you, but here's an example of something where it is like a very small layer of a problem that you're better abstracted.
Okay.
Like,
Yeah.
should I use SSL for the system or not at this point of time is inappropriate conversation, because whether you use it or not, I mean, you could say it's a no-brainer, come on, use it, no big deal. Or the fact that you have to use it or not use it does not really change the discourse much.
Yeah.
So I would actually, so this is one of those questions where I would actually, even if it pops in my head because it's an important question, it's relevant, it's absolutely required. If I were to really build a system, it doesn't really go towards my purpose in the interview. So I would deprioritize this question. Same thing on the encryption as well, whether you encrypt it or not, seems like a simple like filter on top of the design, because again you could have like a central encryption system where the encryption is between the server and the customer, or you could have a point-to-point encryption where it's actually encrypted at the client and then it's decrypted at the other client, right? So we could have it either ways, and that is a very small addition on top of our system. So again, the same thing comes in here. So I'm glad you brought it up, but not pointing at you. But all I'm saying is that this would be one of those important questions which are less in terms of priority, because I think the one advantage that question has is that it actually adds another bullet point here, like, hey, this candidate is thinking actively about security and customer trust. So I like that, right? So these are all auxiliary data points that come there, but I think the benefits don't outweigh the risks at this point of time. So I would not ask these questions, and if I do think about these questions, I'll probably pen them. There's no good way to, in an interview, there's no good way to note take these things. Like if I were to be doing this in a system design review with my engineering team, right? So I would list out all the questions I have for my engineers or for my peers, and I would only ask the relevant ones, because it doesn't make sense to go get down to the weeds and have this discussion. So I would make a note of these things, because I'm going to ask this 2 months from now when this design is a lot more fleshed out. Not now. But then in an interview, I don't have that opportunity. So if you have a good way of, if you are doing note paper, like notepad, pen thing, then write down these things, but don't ask.
Sure.
Because you can use them later. But if you're doing it on the whiteboard, it's a little hard, little tricky. I have written things down in the whiteboard in the corner, saying I have a few other questions, but we'll come back to that later. Let's get the core ones out of the door. So if you could do that, okay? What's next?
So one question I have is, are all users visible to each other? So can everyone text each other, or is it like like WhatsApp, person has to be on your list, or in some way connected with you?
Mm-hmm.
So is that a relevant?
I like how you actually phrased this, because I think your core question is actually an entity question, saying do I need to maintain a friends list? But rather than saying the word friends list, which is more of an entity and a behavior, you're asking the question which is essentially saying that are all users visible to all users, or is there any other restriction around the user's visibility? So I like how you've taken a question which is actually in those levels 3 and 4 and have classified it into a level 2.5, that's a good way of asking the question. So for now, let's assume that everybody is visible to everybody. All right, easy system, no friends list, like visibility of the. I like how you've done that. So that's a good example of how you would take a behavior or an entity question and cast it into a need question. All right, a little more. What is?
So is it a relevant question to ask whether it's going to be used on phone, on desktop, or?
How will that affect your design? So that's the answer. So I would not ask that question yet. Not yet.
Not the old.
Yeah. Not yet. But one thing is essentially one of the things you might want to do is the reason why that might be relevant is I'm trying to understand the usage pattern. So is the customer always connected? Is it something that the customer always have? Like do they have it on them? Because with that, a lot of things change. Like if it's a I think I'm trying to see what's a better way of actually answering that. It's a usage question, like how does a customer use this? Because that will change a lot of the other common expectations that customers have. So if I'm on the phone and that's what the expectation is, then I expect immediate notification. I expect notification. I expect ringing. I expect to see people who are using it right now, who are currently on. And there's like a few other expectations that get built in. So I might want to ask that question more in terms of figuring out. But again, the filter that I want to apply to my questions before I ask is that going to significantly change my? I want to ask a need-based question to figure out how I can model my actors, my entities, my behavior, and my further assumptions. So that's what I would want to do. So in this particular case, I'm not sure of the answer. At the face of it, it looks like it doesn't matter whether it's for the website or for a phone. It looks like the same because you are designing it as a web app anyways. It's going to be used on the phone inside a web view, or it's going to be used in a computer. Doesn't matter. But I think the reason why I like that question is because that changes the behavior expectations. Because a typical customer who's on the phone expects he's on the go, he or she has the phone with them. There's a lot more implicit expectations around what they should be doing. Versus on the other scenario, which is like on the desktop, there is no implicit behavior
But
expectation.
whatever answers are to that, whatever expectations come out, they fall more in the category of system design versus the object-oriented, right? Isn't that?
Actually, thank you. Yes, based on that, it's not the right question. But you're right. So the question is relevant if I would ask that question for a system design because that significantly changes the pattern. Again, everybody is susceptible to making this mistake. So did I, where we are confusing a system design with the over design. When I was actually responding to you, I was thinking more in system design pattern. So very good pushback on that. I think what we should do is I would not ask that question now. Clear, right?
I have a similar
One
one.
second,
So,
go ahead.
like another clarification is most of the chat systems are that it's server. It's not a standard client-server relationship. The server is the one that's controlling the queuing and the server. So you basically are a user and you're on, and the server's determining when you're available to actually send rather than pulling for it. And so there's many different protocols that people are using, WebSockets or long polling or things like this. But those are strictly
System design questions.
But
so
they're the first place I want to go for what am I building?
Right. It is very tempting to actually think of this as that. If you do most of that, it's going to be very hard for you to demonstrate encapsulation, inheritance, polymorphism, and
Right.
what is the fourth one?
So do you even bother clarifying? Like, we're just assuming this works in the same way as most chat servers, and so we're.
That's a system design
Don't
concept.
even
I
go-
would just
okay.
ignore that
Okay.
line of thinking completely. I would just make a note of it if I have to. Again, you need to find a good way to do that. It feels as a candidate, every now and then when I have this conversation, right? And it's been a while since I have interviewed, so I don't know how that feeling is. But in design reviews and whenever I'm a part of reviews like that, there will be these brilliant insights that I have which are actually inappropriate for the current discussion that we have, and I feel bad not making that statement because it's a brilliant insight. I want to make that happen. I want to actually ask that question. I want to provide that insight, but I cannot. Because what we are having right now is a needs conversation, not a behavior conversation, definitely not a system design conversation. I don't want to do that. So what I do is I make a note of it, try to figure it out later, and in a group discussion where it actually pains me a lot is when somebody does not respect the protocol and will make the exact same brainwave that I had. They would make that statement, and everybody would actually, yeah, it's a brilliant idea. I'm like, I knew it before. So, I feel bad about it, but that's okay. So I'm assuming as a candidate it will be roughly the same, right? You have a fantastic idea and you want to share it with the interviewer because obviously it is a part of what you've been thinking, but it's not appropriate at that point of time. So I would feel bad killing like a perfectly good idea, but keeping your focus on will actually make you a lot more effective. It's not necessary to share every thought you have. So, all right.
Since there is a group, do we have a different role of user in that group, saying that these are normal users, these are admin, or who can control the group?
I like that. So the first is there are no groups.
Oh, okay. No.
So there are no groups. So we did that. We said there's only one. So there's no friends list. There is no concept. There's no one-to-many. It's just one-to-one, and it's just everybody. So imagine this is the BBS era where we had like like hundreds of users who are dialed up or whatever else. So everybody can see everybody, and you can ping, message anyone and anything. So it's kind of one of those systems. No specific roles. There's no admins, no moderators. Free for all at this point of time. Keep it simple. We can add more behaviors later. Are we good to jump to the next one, or do we still have more needs-based questions?
Do we need to support like multiple conversations, multiple one-on-one conversations?
Simultaneously, you want to
Yeah.
support multiple one-on-one conversations,
Do we
and
need to
you're,
support that?
so would you phrase it as a clarification or an assumption?
I'll ask for a clarification because yeah, it would be assumption because obviously all chat servers you can like
Most chat servers are multiple things, and you're going to make an assumption saying, I want to assume that one customer can have simultaneous multiple conversations, so I need to have a way of keeping that separate. And that seems like a logical assumption, right? Because you will be talking to multiple people. It's not like I have to talk to you and finish this conversation before I start another one, because you're online, right? So that's it. So two good things. I like how you started with saying, is there a need for, is how you phrased it. So I like that. That's actually clearly in the need space. The question would be whether it is an assumption or a clarification. I think I would, a good call on the assumption side. This is not this would be one of those cases where I think a clarification might negatively impact your thing. It's like, should the system be like available or something? Should the system perform fast? Those things are not really questions that you want to ask, right? So in that same vector, should I have multiple conversations? I think it's almost like obvious that it needs to have it. So 90-95%, the answer is yes. Then make it an assumption. That's the rule I would apply. I don't want to ask a question. Like even if I think of it as a question, I would actually try to answer it myself, and then try to predict if the answer is going to be that more likely than not, and then just state that as an assumption. Right?
Is the number of users that's going to use the chat server, and if it's supposed to be used in the internal network or not, is like something that we should ask in
So
this system?
let me rephrase the question. Is there a restriction or limitation on the number of users who can be online or who can be with the system? And is it actually deployed in a World Wide Web or within an intranet? And any thoughts on these two questions? So again,
system.
these are more system design questions. These are good questions for a system design question, and even there, I would actually question how does your architecture change whether it's an internal network or an external network, does your architecture actually change? Your security needs might actually go down or go up, or your integration with your LDAP server or something might change, but those are just abstractions that are bolted on top. So good questions, good thought process, but even for a system design, I would actually hesitate asking those questions because that just seems like a very simple bolt on. And for the first question about restriction on the number of users, seems like a limitation, which is more like, is there a need to restrict? That would be the question. And I think the answer is obviously yes. Because almost always you would want some restriction. Even if it's like 1 million users, I still want a restriction because I want my system to not like crawl over and die and make sure nobody can use it, is a problem. So there has to be a logical limit which protects my services from going down. The limit may be high. So I would make that an assumption, not a clarification. Right? And then we can move forward. So I know that is a system design thing, so let's come back to O. Any other clarifications or any other needs?
So is there a need to maintain the sequence of the messages?
Question. So is there a need to maintain a sequence of messages?
So like for some reason, if someone sort of was not available at that point of time and he logged back in, I mean, it sometimes so happens that we see the later message first and the previous goes under that.
The order of messages, right, that you see, it's a little bit of a system domain space, system design space, is because due to networking challenges and there's no guarantee of the order of messages. Like the order of receipt of messages might be in a different order. Or if you're actually sending multiple messages and you are offline for some reason and the network connectivity comes up, you send all the messages sort of like one after another, and there could be gaps in terms of you might get the second message first and the first message afterwards, and there could be mismatched ordering of messages in terms of sending at the client side, or the receiving at the server side, or the receipt at the recipient side. So it could be any challenges. So the question here is that, is there any specific requirements around maintaining the need for it? Good question. Too much detail at this point of time is what I would not go there, and I would start jumping into the actors and behavior. So this is one of those places where it's at the edge of where too much clarifications or not. I don't know. I might still ask if my other clarifications were quick and I'm still within like the first 5-minute space, I might actually ask, or I might just say, you know what, it's time for me to move on. So I might not do that. So this is one of those questions where it's at the edge of high quality need question, which may not make immediate, it changes the design, but not significantly. So that's where I'm thinking, right?
What if it is not assumption, because if usually people talk, it should be maintained as order, right?
It's an expectation, so it's an assumption.
Yeah.
But I would not even state that because it's so implicit that I don't want to. And I would actually call that out as saying, well, I'm going to assume that the messages are going to go through, like I send a message to you, you send a message to me, they all happen in chronological order, so you get it as soon as I send it, and I get it as soon as you send it, so we're good. So the ordering is obviously preserved the same way. So that is an assumption, there's no questions there. But there are challenges where if you're offline for a while, and then your messages are actually buffered, and then you send them out at the same time, some of your messages may actually come faster than the other, and that may not be the same order. So the expectation is here, do I have to build some additional rules and logic to make it work? That is extra sort of like functionality where you're trying to to generate like a sequence of events on the client side, make sure that it's more like the TCP packet arrangement, right?
Yeah.
Regardless of whichever order it comes, I still want to know how to put them together later. So it's more in that particular domain, and I would like to do that, but I think it's too much implementation detail of sorts, and I would stay away from that. So stating that, no, I would not even state that as an assumption because it's so implicit that it is not worth calling it out. All right, any other needs before we jump on? Go ahead.
Which data every user needs? For example, username, avatar, maybe something.
So that is actually when we model the entities, that's when I want to ask that question. So there is still the need does not. So you don't have to treat this as more like a waterfall, right? Where you actually finish all your requirements up front and then implementation work. That's not how you want to look at it. It is iterative. There is the communication and conversation is going to continue happening. So it is iterative. So these are parameters and fields that I would even behavior definition. Some parts of it can happen later. So I would focus on that question is a brilliant question for the entity definition. So in about a minute or two, we'll pivot over to entities. So when we do that, we can jump in with that. Okay.
I'm not sure if we went over this, but do you need to know availability? Like, is the other person online at the time or no?
So we kind of made an implicit assumption everybody's online.
Okay.
Or the fact that the server will keep track of it, the client will come and get it whenever they get it.
Okay.
So we kind of just quickly walk through it. That might border into it's not an over design thing, but it's again a network and availability. So it becomes a system design thing. So close.
One more question. So I send a message to someone and they might be online, but how would I know if they have like seen the message or not? Like, is there any status indication there? Like once they view it, you get like double check mark on the receiver.
So, fantastic question. So the question was essentially like, nowadays you see in WhatsApp and even in Facebook and Hangout where it tells you when the other person has seen the message. Or like, Facebook it says like seen at this time. Right? It will tell you when they saw it and is it required? Is that a requirement for the system? And is that a customer need? So my feedback here is that I think it's a fantastic question and I would add that when I'm doing the behavior modeling and not right away. I don't know the answer to that. I think it's okay asking it up front as well, then you can just cache that information and then continue when you're doing your design. But I would ask that when I'm either doing entity modeling to store the state of the data, or I can ask this during the behavior modeling to talk about the communication. And then we will talk about that. And the behavior modeling, when we do this, you'll probably see there are a couple of strategies you can use to do the behavior modeling. There are like tight coupling between like here are all the APIs, this request response, which is what over design generally prescribes. But then now you also have this data-driven design where it's like essentially there's an open-ended API where the data dictates what to do and you can change the API anytime willy-nilly or add new APIs by just changing the data and the shape of the data you send along with it. So it becomes a little different and that borders into system design more than over design at that point. So good question. All right, go ahead.
Is there a need to block the messages from
Is there any need to block the messages in questions? I think it's now we are getting into the same territory of it is a behavior, and or possibly some sort of like do I need to have a list of blocked users as an entity element? So this question goes towards that. So I would again the first thing is start from customer needs, work backwards is what you're trying to think of, right? So start from the end objective, end goal. So we've spent a little bit of time going around it. This is probably around 30 minutes at this point. This is not what we will spend in the interview, obviously. This all that happened right now is a 5-minute conversation. That's it, right? That's all we're talking about. And it's a lot more verbose here by design, and it's a lot more back and forth that's going on by design. So the expectation is 5 minutes at most. So which means you get between 4 to 10 questions depending on how succinct the questions are and how easy the answers are. There's no back and forth, right? It's a, do we need this? Should it be this way? I'm going to make this assumption. Can you tell me this, right? 4 questions, that's all you get time to in that particular thing, with a little bit of discussion, and if there's no discussion, then you get about maybe 8 or 10 questions. 30 seconds per question is super fast. If you speak fast like I do, then you might be able to get more in, but I wouldn't recommend that. All right, so, sorry. Okay, so that's why a lot of these questions that we're asking now is we've gone past the point of where the basic questions have been taken care of, and now we should start jumping into the next level. So again, now that we've spent the basic questions, we're done with that. Now we're going further down. I can see all of us are now struggling and stretching to figure out what else can I ask? What else can I ask? And now we are bordering into these other things right now, which is why the last few questions have been more of that way. These would not be the number one questions that you would ask, right? These would not be the first or second question that you're going to ask the interviewer. So very clear that we're actually gone past that. So at some point of time, you need to detect that you are beyond the need space and need to move, right? The good interviewers actually will prompt you, saying, that's okay, you know what, we can figure it out as you go. Why don't we start with modeling the design. Let's start working on the design, enough of your questions is what they would say, not directly, but bad interviewers may not. And they may let you happily dig your own grave by, you keep asking all the questions, and then 45 minutes done, all right, I'm out of here, and you're not done with your design. So you need to be mindful of that. Interviewers might help you, but you don't want to be at the mercy of a good interviewer. So do your own
question about the supported language. Is it English only or English and localized?
How does that change the design?
Because we need to store the text. This might be.
How does that change the design? A string is a string, right? So the question would be whether you're storing internationalized data, or is it ASCII string, or is it Unicode string, or something else would be the change. But it's one entity which is modeled appropriately. The questions where it will be is there a language preference that a customer might have, and things like those would be entities on the customer object.
Okay.
So there's few things you can choose, but again, back to the same questions. All of us are now we have walked into that. We've gone beyond the basic need space now. We are now walking into. We are trying to almost think of behavior and entities and try to model that back into need question. Good exercise to do, but at some point you might want to stop. If you're completely clueless about the actual needs-based questions, you're drawing a blank, then you might want to do the exercise of picking 1 or 2 entity questions or behavior questions, modeling it back into a need question. But that's it. Have a minimum of 2 questions, enough to let the interviewer know that you ask meaningful questions and well-thought meaningful questions which actually show that you're thinking through the problem. So please do that, but you don't have to spend any more than 5 minutes on this. Okay?
I have a question. How do you distinguish between a step 2.5 and 1? Because what I'm today, for step 1, we are more asking about the customer needs now. So when we go to the step, for a clarification, what kind of the question we should ask? Because it's more asking about the customer needs in this step 2.
So thank you for that. So from I have munched 1 and 2.5 in this case, because what I'm trying to look at is the first clarification I want is why are you here, interviewer? What do you want to take away? Are you here for a system design? Are you here for a O design? Are you here for my code? Right? That is the number 1 clarification I want, because that's what I want to know, what you want from the interview. So that is the first clarification. Then on, all my clarifications are actually to get to the need space. So all the clarification that we just talked about is all about what does the customer need, what's the system need, how is it modeled, and so all of those questions. And so that's where we are. The classification step in between is essentially it helps you ask these clarifying questions, because knowing now that it is a chat server and it is a near real-time system which exchanges data, I'm able to ask questions which are on customers' need spaces. So I would while this is sort of linear 1, 2, 2.5, 3, and 4, I think there's a little bit of, I just wrote it down without too much of a thought, so there might be some opportunity for us to review and revisit. I think there is probably a step 0, which is to figure out why are we here, what's subject to an interview, and then there's probably step 2 or step 1, which is essentially understanding the needs of the system, and then we can go to the other pieces. So I may have to restructure this. I was just figuring out how this actually shows up based on what we were talking about. So this is not, this is not the template, this is not the golden standard or something here. This is not the gold standard. It's just something that that we are using as a mechanism to structure our thoughts for now. So feel free to push back on any of this, feel free to restructure it in a way that makes more sense. But net of it, I'm super glad that at this point of time we still haven't talked about entities, we still haven't talked about behavior so far. And this is essentially the first 5 minutes of the interview so far, right? So this is where we are. This is the 5-minute mark.
Actually, at the first 5 minutes, we just ask more questions about customer needs and think about how it's going to affect our design.
Correct.
Before we go to any entity.
That's correct. That's what I would do. That's what we have been doing here. That's what I would do as well. And in those cases, even if you're struggling to come up with the right clarifying questions, I like how folks have actually kind of proxied future behavior and entity questions, and have reverse modeled that into a need-based phrasing, and they have done that. So it's like a backward way of doing it, but that actually still gets you to the right spot. What I liked about that conversation is that we are not still talking about entities, we are not talking about behavior, because we are still in the need space, and we're clearly there. We're just talking only about customer needs and expectations from the system, not anything to do with the behavior or the entity. So I like that, and that's where we are. So, all right, we are now moving to the next stage, which is do you want to entities or behavior? All right, clearly entities. So now we are unanimous, right? All right, awesome. Okay, so what are the entities at play? Based on whatever we have discussed so far, what are the entities? And before we do that, how would you represent entities on a whiteboard? How do you want to represent the entities on a whiteboard? What do you want to do? What technique do you want to use? Do I just write a bullet list of saying 1, I think I need this, 2, I need this? Or do I just put blocks around it?
A class diagram?
Class diagrams. So okay, a few options I can see is I can see a list. I can see like some kind of like blocks, block diagrams. I can see like a class diagram, the standard UML-esque class diagram. So for a system design question, I would prefer the block diagram, because you're talking about these are like big blocks of items, and here's the interaction between the blocks and things like that. So that does mirror entities and behavior. Like in that particular scenario, you have systems or system boundaries, and you have interactions between the systems. So the interaction map to behavior, system maps to this. So it could get a little tricky doing that. But for system design, I would prefer this. For object-oriented design, I would generally prefer like a class diagram-esque thing. It's a lot easier, and because class diagram has, you can show inheritance properly, you can write like the entities attributes pretty clearly. Behavior can be listed out reasonably well. So let's do class diagram. And all right, so I'm going to try to write it in some form. Okay, what's the first entity that you want to have?
User message.
User.
Let me ask that question. So is that the sequence you want to go? How did you pick user as the first entity to list out?
It's the most obvious one.
Okay?
It's the most obvious one.
It's the most obvious one.
One user send a message to them. We have to start the user.
But the goal is to design a chat server. So do you not want to start with this is a question, not a direction. Would you not want to start with if you had time to list out one entity, what would that be? If my question is design a chat server. Of course, right? It was a setup, all right? All right. So now if you have time to do a little bit more, then what is your next set of entities that will come up? So my question here is essentially, how would you structure your entities in logical layers? Because you want to think of because at some point of time, like user demographics might be an object which is linked to the user, right? Or something like, or user's friend list might be an object which is kind of associating multiple users. You may want to have that, but that is not relevant at this point, and you can bolt it on later. So a user is definitely required, a message is definitely required. So these are almost like priority one objects. If I were to add priorities to objects, so that makes sense. So it's fine the way we have done it so far. Like if you were to say, of course it's going to be user, of course it's going to be message and whatnot. That's like you're enumerating it. That's okay. In general, a more preferred approach would be to go layer by layer and start kind of thinking what are the number one important objects. That's okay. Super high priority objects, next priority, next lower, and so on and so on. Right. So we want to think through that. So I would have preferred a chat server as the first object, but let's go with what we have. Right. What is user? We talk about message. There's one more advantage of doing it the way I was talking about, which is that the positioning of the object in your class model becomes a lot simpler because you would place the related objects right next to it. Like my user and message is here, right? Now this is stupid because I don't want the message to be here because I want message to be pretty much like somewhere here because my chat server is going to be here. So I don't have a full layout of my class diagram in my mind right now. So in a whiteboard, I can't move things that easily. If I were designing an object model like this class model in some sort of a UI tool, like a rational rows or something, no big deal because I can put it in any order, I can retile them, reposition them as appropriate. The relationships become a little harder. So I would work from what I need and then work onwards from there. So that's one of the ways I was thinking. So that's why I think it's a more this is kind of difference between like a good design and an excellent design. So even if you do it this way, it's not bad. So this is not terrible. This is actually still a good design. So looking at what would it take to knock it out of the park would be a view where you are thinking of this upfront. You have strategized this clearly, and you know how to do that. If you think you need a way of I don't know how many of us are actually visually we know how spatial awareness in terms of how things need to be and whatnot. I'm terrible at it, so it takes me multiple iterations to get it right. So I might actually, if I were to do this, I'd probably do it on a piece of paper or write down separately. I might actually go list the objects entities first and then try to model them in a model because that way I know how to leave enough space for various things. So different techniques work. So which is why the list is not a bad idea, even though it may sound as like, oh, why am I wasting my time with it? You might actually go through the process of listing it first independently, and then when you're drawing the diagram, then you can, from that list, I prioritize, and then I can draw the diagram. Because that's where I'm trying to go from the entities to sort of like the properties and then the behavior, right? So I'm just listing entities. A list might just work well for you. All right. So what do we have? So let's do user and message. What's next? Server. Is that what you want to call it?
Is that your chat server level you're talking about?
Say again?
Is that your chat server level you're talking about?
That's what I'm hearing. So
your overall object?
It's just one object?
Or is it your overall object? Is that what you're talking about, like your guy?
The master chat server. That's the central. I have a central chat server, which is where the user logs on, which is where the user is sending the message.
Oh, that'd be like a user manager. What calls a user manager?
No, may not be user manager. User manager is a different entity than chat server.
Different. Okay.
Controller. Okay. What else?
User manager.
User manager. Okay.
Message and the chat are different, like, or are we saying message is the chat over here?
What is user manager?
Some sort of an entity that actually encapsulates. It's a manager pattern which manages the user entity. So see, injecting the same pattern. Anyway, all right.
Conversation.
One second. There's no chat rooms here. We specifically kept it out. No groups. It's just one-on-one chats only.
So
chat or conversation?
Chat or conversation is a different entity, right?
But if
Do you
it's
need it?
one-on-one, then
Yeah.
we need to have
Multiple messages in one chat, or is it?
Yeah, we need
One second. So let me go back to the user manager. We'll come back to that. We don't want to put it against. So anyone who disagrees, we need a user manager.
Nice. I'm still not clear what
Like
it is.
what
Not
is
clear.
it?
Go on. Ask questions. Be the interviewer. A candidate has said, I want to have a user manager.
Yeah,
Ask
what's
the
the
question.
purpose over there?
What does it do? Anyone who actually is supporting a user manager, what does the user manager do?
Yeah, so it will be As in, the chat server will contain a user manager which takes care of everything related to users like login and anything specific to the user profile only, not related to the messaging and corresponding.
So, mostly fine with that assertion. But if I inject the concept of the manager design pattern, then a manager's responsibility is not to take care of authentication. A manager is more just purely responsible for the create, update, modify, delete, and also to do some sort of behavior abstractions here that provide core functionality which is common for all users. The manager, just look at how factory, for example, right? I may have a user factory because that's how I create users. I may have a user manager, which is the entity that actually either looks at a user factory to create it and then does other things to manipulate the user, tries to do other behaviors which relate only to user. Doesn't no chat, no server, nothing else, none of those other pieces. So that's what the manager pattern is. So having a block there saying it's a user manager, I don't even have to specify the behavior for that. I can just say, hey, it's a manager, which means everybody understands what a manager does. But if you increase the responsibility of a manager to do something else, which is like login, authentication, and a bunch of other things along with it, that becomes a challenge. So be careful when you're stretching the boundaries of the design patterns. Actually provide conveniences, but it also provides restrictions. You have to color within the lines there, right? Otherwise it becomes hard. Otherwise it becomes free for all, and you're also. So why design patterns? Maybe let's take a step back. Why design patterns? Why do we use design patterns?
Because we can give the object-oriented design more way, the level way to handle some tasks. For example, if you use a manager in here, you can give that manager some tasks that the user don't need to do anything, and you can link between the manager and the user later.
Fair enough. So like the design pattern as a concept essentially has, in my view, has like 3-4 core functionalities. The primary functionality is it is a well-known way of solving a well-known problem. So we know that entities need to be managed, we know entities need to be created, we know entities need to be handled and whatnot. So that's why a factory is helpful for this, that's why in a particular pattern like this, a singleton is useful like this, and so on, right? So it offers like a structured, standardized way of doing it. It's a template of how it is done. So it is much like if I know how to calculate the area of a square, and I'm given like a room and I need to find out what the area is, then I'm going to break it down into smaller problems that I know how to solve, and then use that to come up with to solve the bigger problem. Mathematically, we've done that multiple times. Design pattern offers you to abstract out the bigger problem you have into smaller problems, and then solve these smaller problems as with patterns. So that's one of the big advantages, where it gives you a template for solving. The second big advantage is that it actually offers you simpler communication, like a one phrase, one sentence thing saying, you know what, I'm going to have like a singleton chat server is adequate for you to know all the behaviors that are associated with that singleton. You know that there's only one instance of the chat server. You know that it has the following behaviors, following capabilities, how it works. Like if I were to say something is a decorator, you know what it does, and things like those, right? So the communication is actually very clear between two different designers who are trying to exchange their ideas. One of the hardest parts of design is the communication aspect, and design patterns actually help you communicate things differently. It's almost the same as me saying, get to the airport and then do this, right? So I don't have to explain how to get to the airport because you're going to do it on your own. You and I know exactly what airport means, you and I know what get to means, so that's it. The phrase is easy. If I were to say, take a left, go right, then do this, go do that, the communication is a lot more verbose, and we are probably repeating things that you already know. It's not useful. So as an analogy, design patterns offer that communication model which is simple. So why I bring that up is that if you stretch that, design patterns are well known, well understood, and well communicated. So if you actually start saying, you know, a manager is actually strictly supposed to do, like a singleton is supposed to do only one thing, but what if I actually, make singleton to mean like a doubleton or something? We have two things which will do the same singleton thing. Now you and I are not on the same page. Like when I say singleton, I mean something else. When you mean singleton, you're kind of meaning the stretched form of singleton. I don't even know if doubleton exists, but pretend it does. Right? So then you and I are not on the same page, and that causes confusion. So what I would like to do is, whenever we are using the design patterns, let's try to stick to the formal definition of what the design pattern is and the well understood, well approached format of that. There are a few cases where the design pattern has some broad applications, like if you were to say like a factory is supposed to do this versus like a factory method does something else. There's a very little difference between the two. You and I may not be clear in terms of what is the actual pattern. Then there may be a little bit of more explanation required for examples or something else. But otherwise, stick to the patterns. So here, I would just say user manager and forget about it. I won't even talk about it. Unless you add more complexities to it, you don't even have to talk about it. Okay? All right, so user, message, chat server. What else?
Conversation.
Conversation. Do you need conversation?
Yes.
Do you need conversation?
No.
No, yes, no, yes.
Something
Why no?
to say that it's like happening with the specific user.
Yeah, what
about
one-on-one conversation?
We can go without that also, but it will make a little complex to
Nice.
figure that out later.
So can I have a message manager, which actually can give me message sent to anyone or from anyone? Like not a message manager per se, but more like a message facade or message factory or something that, not just creating a new message. I want to use the right design pattern term here. But what if I have like a message store, which can actually give me all historic messages that fits a specific query pattern? So message is just one entity which represents a piece of text, which is what size of the can you elaborate the message? What does a message contain entity wise? Sender, recipient, and
Timestamp.
Maybe timestamp.
text. Okay. I didn't put enough space. I'm going to write timestamp.
Status, if you want to figure out if it's delivered and read and.
So this would be a fantastic time to ask that question. And even then, it may not be necessary because you may want to, like, you've demonstrated and you've thought through the message attributes. The extra attributes are not required at this point of time. Once you do the behavior conversation and you say, should I actually show if a message has been read or delivered? Yes. Then you know what? I just quickly go back to message and I update that. You've demonstrated that you know where the entity relationship very well. So that makes sense. So I would actually use that for demonstrating that I can modify my objects or my design at real time quickly to adapt, right? So I like that, but I don't want to waste that weapon here. I want to use it for later. All right. So the thing is that you have all of these things.
What do we have? What is it again?
Sender, recipient, the text, and the timestamp. 4 items at this point. So does that uniquely define a message? Right?
Yeah.
So we have the message, we can package the message, we can send it. Now this message is what is sort of in flight, what has been sent, what has been created, in flight, sent, right? So I would like to have some kind of like a message storage. We talked about that based on various things, and that message store has essentially all it does is that it actually persists the messages somewhere, and it offers the convenient function of like essentially store, retrieve, maybe delete, or something like that. I'm thinking, so I'm trying to be purposefully a little abstract here, but the goal here would be that the question that you asked about conversation, can I not just say, get me all the messages that were sent or sent by me or received by me?
You can't, because the problem is that unless you have like a conversation ID or something, how are you going to tell which? Like if I have a conversation with you right now and then I have a conversation with you 10 minutes from now, those messages.
But are they different conversations?
Yes.
How do you define a conversation?
You open and close a conversation. Basically. You would
But
start
if you're
one.
always online,
You would start one and stop one.
based on how we.
So that would be more like an IRC server then.
If you're always online, if you're always there, like WhatsApp, right, or Facebook Messenger, there is no concept of conversation in Facebook Messenger. It's always there. So whenever I go and open your message history, I always see all the messages I sent earlier, right? And not every one of the messages I sent to you, but at least the last few. Then if I scroll up, I see more because that's more it's more of a convenience.
Right, then you wouldn't care about conversation.
Then there's no conversation per se.
Right.
But the usage pattern is a little different here. But go on.
So, if you don't have conversation, then the way to construct the conversation is for user one, figure out all the message from message store where Sender is
Sender or
user
recipient is this?
So sender and recipient both.
Sender or recipient is me.
Okay.
Is that, and then I would take all of that information.
But so sender and recipient is this.
So
but
what is a?
I will have a multiple chat.
Okay, let me repeat this one. What is a conversation? A conversation is between two people.
Two people, yes.
Correct. So if I were to reconstruct the conversation between me and you, what am I going to say? I'm going to say, show me where sender is me and recipient is you, or sender is you and recipient is me, and then get me all the messages and put them in the timestamp order, and that's my conversation with you.
So how to figure out that I have to? So we have a conversation between you and me, or should I go saying that I have 1,000 users? For me, I'll go and figure out. Oh, give me all the message for 999 users because I don't know whether I have a conversation or not.
So I think.
So what does it like?
If you see the moment that
So it's one-to-one.
It is one-to-one. What he's saying is that,
Vivek, right? So
but you don't know how many conversations
how
I
many
have
conversation
had.
you have?
If there are 1,000 users in the system,
when the first time log into the system, how
No,
to-
but like whenever you are storing, right, we are not going to store it in, like everyone's data together, right? You are going to store with some ID with Vivek and your
We haven't
conversation, you
discussed
might have
that.
some unique ID, right?
that is what the question was like. I'm trying to
When
actually
you try
almost
to
prevent.
pull up the data, okay, it's the
I'm
last.
trying to
quarter.
avoid having a conversation ID because I don't think there is any value to it. That's what I'm trying to get to.
I mean, you
That
can,
is, and I see pushback around like, no, we should have something that uniquely identifies a conversation. I'm trying to ask why.
I'm saying that you can do it, but then there will be a lot of things that is required on a message store and reconstructing the conversation. If you put a message ID, it will be easier. I mean, conversation ID. For example, I logged in after, say, I'm offline and I logged into the system. Now I have to pull up all my conversation.
So since you are offline and you log in after a while, there is no chance of you sending any message.
No,
It's
but-
only conversations where you are the recipient.
No.
So I will be looking for all the messages that were sent to me in the last 48 hours that I was offline.
No, I have to reconstruct all conversations.
No, that is the second step. The first step is to retrieve all the messages that I got.
Okay.
And of all the messages I got, whenever you pick a message and say, okay, you have a new message from Vivek, and you go open on that one, then you would expect to see all the conversation between you and I.
Yeah, you don't need, if you're gonna,
But
if
you would
you're
have
gonna
to
keep it.
retrieve all the messages, right?
You'll get all the messages, but then there's probably a restriction, which essentially you need to find a. Now we are walking into system design territory, where you're saying convenient function. There are a million messages between him and I. We are like, we chat a lot. Then the challenge is that I only want to see the last 1,000 messages, not more than that, or last 50 messages, and then as the customer scrolls up, I want to see more, right? So that becomes more of a convenience function, which can be implemented as a part of your message retriever, where you can add, say, you can add limits to the query, or you can add like limits to the time ranges. You can limit it in a few different ways. But all I'm saying is that adding a conversation ID specifically is not going to help you with anything.
I agree, it's not needed
Not
because
an
of,
ID,
because of
but-
the way we're designing it.
Because of the way it has been currently, the design currently doesn't lead that.
One question, so the way we are saving it right now, the message store, so it is like each user has his own list of messages he sent, each of them. And then eventually to reconstruct the conversation, what we are doing is, what you sent, where you are the sender and where you are the recipient, and the same thing applies to
The other person.
Yeah, but in doing that, it's a performance issue, right? Like,
So that's system design territory at this point of time. You can apply convenience, you can apply design principles on top of that to make sure that you can solve for it if you need to. If you need to, you may not. You don't have to get there right now.
The problem with conversation ID too is that if you're not gonna expose that to the user, then it becomes meaningless, right?
Yeah.
Because it's like,
If there's no subject of the conversation or something like that, then it becomes.
you know, how do you decide, like, okay, how do you decide what's in a conversation if the user doesn't initiate? If you have a conversation, the user's got to initiate and end it.
Yeah.
Otherwise, it doesn't make any sense.
Otherwise, it doesn't make sense. So that's why, like, the advantage is that if you actually have rooms and chats and groups, right? You will have a group name, and and you can use a conversation as a construct, which is like a private room with just two people, and you can just use that, and then you can just model a conversation as a group chat with just two people, and then you don't have to do a whole bunch of other magic stuff there, right? Then it becomes easier for you to think about it, easier to visualize, and things like that. So then the message is not sent to a person, but the message is actually sent to a room or a group, and that is just a group of two people. So you could think of it that way. If you want to model it that way, then that simplifies a lot of other, like a group chat and a single chat is no longer different.
That's what I was about to ask. Can we decide this is gonna allow group chats?
No, we said no.
Just single chat? Oh,
Yeah, one to one, one to many, no. Yes, ma'am.
The message store, is it per user or is it like a common store where all the users' messages, I mean, you are messaging 10 people?
The message has a sender, recipient, and a text and a timestamp.
Right.
The message store stores all the messages. So it will be common. That's how I'm looking at it. It's more like a representation of the behavior representation of the data access layer for message. There's probably more I haven't defined the parameters for the store, I haven't as a retrieve and the deletes. If there's any concept of delete or is it inactive, it's
So
not.
we are designing this from the chat server perspective, so the given chat server can be used by several people, right? So, so the message store is like a common message store for all the people who are using the chat server.
That's correct.
So and it is not per user where you have installed a certain chat server, I mean you have installed the client on your system and you're saying that okay, I am chatting, so I have a message store only.
No,
where my
no, no.
messages are
So
going.
we are, based on the previous conversation, we are looking at it as a very specific, like single server manages everything. It's not that the client storing the messages, like WhatsApp actually client stores the messages, there is no server storage of messages. You could have it that way as well if you want to, but that's not what we are gunning for here. Okay? So we did message store. Keep it simple at this point, we can complicate it as we go. Okay? Anything else?
For chat server, I think we should have a list of a map of user as the key and the list of messages as the values.
Why?
Are we on entities now?
Why?
Sorry, are we
Still on chat server.
Right, but are we on properties? Are we doing properties in chat server now?
We started properties already.
Okay.
We've already breached into properties, unfortunately. So, do we have any? So, stop. Any more? Thank you. Any more entities?
Is session manager needed or is that a chat? So it's
There is no session, so there is no management because everybody's always online. Everybody's always online. Everybody can send a message anytime. This is a request response, anyways, right? The user can talk to the chat server, get their current messages, send a new message.
No, not that. I mean, I meant in terms of connections.
Networking domain, system design. So good push. So entity is done. Let's go to properties. Okay. So user properties are probably pretty straightforward. I think you probably want to have just like the info, your name, your password, your whatever else, email address, and whatever else you need, and that's probably it. I don't think there's anything more than that. Message we talked about. User manager will probably have everything that you need to manage a user. Since it's a standard design pattern, we can actually skip that conversation entirely. Chat server? More interesting. Chat server. You said that you need a map of.
We should have a list of map of a user as the key and the messages as the list.
So I hear that you need a map
of user as the key.
User as the key and
list of messages as the
messages.
And we should have a list of map so that because for a chat server's perspective, it will be a many-to-many relationship. Many users can have many different conversations with many other users.
So at that point, we should have had a conversation class.
Oh, the message store is there, right?
So you have message store already need I like what you're saying, but I'm just trying to I'm curious to understand how will you use this entity, this property?
So chat server would basically be acting as a central actor for all the conversations from many. So from chat server's perspective, there will be like many users, anonymous, and many users who will be senders, and many users who will be the recipients. So we should have a list of mapped, and one user can have many messages. So it's like one-to-many for user to message.
Can I park that for a second and come back to let's do the behaviors quickly, and then we can come back to the entities.
Sure.
For chat server. Let's start with the behavior of chat server, because I think properties wise it's a little tricky because the behavior will dictate the property, and the properties might be just convenience functions. Because like I really don't see a good value for a map of this information, because one single call to message will get me that information anyways. So why would I need that? Why would that not be that caching of the data is not that relevant to me at this point of time?
One method in chat server.
Might actually give me the same thing. So let's go to behavior, and then let's use the properties as a way to, I don't want, so convenience caching properties are not really something you want to put here. Okay, so that's not something you want to design in your in the interview.
One question. So we don't have any, so we're thinking that our chat server will have the user and the message mapping. So right now, based on what we defined, the properties and the user, none of them have any link to the message or the message flow. So
Sender recipients are all users. Will be linked to user. Sender is user, recipient is user.
this message store should also have.
Message store is just the data access layer for messages. It may have other query capabilities. So data access layer is essentially a reasonably well understood design pattern which offers like the CRUD services like create, retrieve, update and delete services on any entity from a data store. Could be DynamoDB like or MongoDB like NoSQL instance, or could be Oracle MySQL like relational instance. It could be any of them. It doesn't matter. The data access layer essentially just offers you like a convenient way of here's a message, persist it for me. Here's a message, retrieve it for me. Or here's a query pattern based on which I wanted to retrieve the message for me. So the query pattern could be as simple as get me all the messages pertaining to this user. And that in turn could translate that to like where sender or recipient is this, right? So then what you have done is now you and I are not talking the same language when I say data access layer. Because data access layer, the queries are supposed to be restricted to a specific field or a bunch of fields, but you can't have business logic layer there. So if the data access layer says like, applying like arbitrary restrictions on different fields with limits on the returned value, the returned data and the ordering criteria, get me the value, that data access layer everybody understands. If you add, if the retrieve, right, the get messages from store, if this contains essentially the information, if you were to simply say related to user 1 or whatever that is, and then you say 1000 recent messages, right? If you did this, then the data access layer now needs to understand that related actually means that where it is either the storer or the receiver. That makes it harder. That makes it like that. That violates like a simple data access layer contract. If I were to simply say data access layer in general, then everybody knows what it means. It means that I give you an object, you can store it. I give you an object ID, I can retrieve it. So usually you have like a message will have a unique ID, which is generally used as a primary key for your entity, so that I can say get me this message ID or something like that. So usually you don't use it for anything except for serialization, deserialization. There is a concept of idempotent. If I get the message received multiple times or sent multiple times, the message ID will only be persisted once, right? Things like those. So you have an ID for most objects. You do have a primary key, even though it's not exposed. So then the store, retrieve, delete should only do just that. Create, retrieve, update, delete should only. The pattern is very simple. I mean, think of it as a RESTful API which offers the capabilities, right? So it's very simple. But if I do something like this, then I'm actually violating the principle already. So we have to think about whether we want to do that or not. It might be the simplest thing to do. If you ask me to build a chat server over a weekend, if I code it up, that's exactly what I will do. I'll just go build a generic data access layer, and then I will just go override it with this extra method and call it a day, right? Okay, so now that we have that, so the chat server will have, so the expectation is that your chat server is what everybody tries to connect to from outside, right? So what are the things, so let's talk about the use cases or the behavior. How does it work? So what will a user do to the chat server? Is there a concept of a user logging into a chat server? So there is no login to a chat server per se, but there is definitely a way of creating a new user. And what does a create new user do? It actually delegates to the user manager to do the creation, but it just delegates. Okay, what's next?
Send message.
So you did create user. Then the next thing is that there is no login concept because the user is already there, the user is already there. We can abstract it out. What is?
Connect to user.
Connection is already there, so connect is done. What
Current
next?
user.
Send message.
The first thing a user does when he joins in would be to retrieve all their messages.
Yes.
From the last time that they were. In this case, it's nothing. So it will be essentially retrieve users or like get my messages or something like that. I don't know what you want to call it. What's the parameter for it?
User ID.
Himself and to him he tried.
Just
No, it's more the user.
You don't know whom to connect. He has to send only his ID. That's it.
Yeah.
So get my messages is like just my ID is all I can give you.
Yeah.
And is there another parameter you might want?
last login time.
Number. Yeah, the last message that I know of, right? Because I only want the new messages. It's what I'm expecting.
No,
we
it's not required, right?
We might want to try everything.
Yeah, in that case, you provide the last message is like eternity. Like from when is the question?
I see.
It's just an optional parameter which will give you, if you know from when, it will just give you that message. It's a convenience function more than anything else.
So basically, it's the last message ID that will.
Yeah, so it's like, I'm going to call it from when or something like that. It's a last message ID.
Some default value.
Something that gives you, and it could be nothing. If it's nothing, I'll give it to you from epoch or from eternity.
Is that a timestamp or a message ID? How do we know the last message ID on this authentication?
Okay. Someone wants to answer that? How will we know what is the last message ID? I'm trying to purposely keep it as abstract as saying, get me from a particular message onwards. From when? Like, do you want it? And it could be, hey, I logged out the last message I got was this. Any message after that is fine. Is what you can do. Or you can say, give me all the messages after this particular timestamp, or something. There could be different ways of doing that. And this, what will it do?
It will go to child layer and.
It will just delegate to the data access layer, and should be able to do that. So here is where I would actually change this guy to do two queries against the data access layer. One query with sender, one query with recipient, then do the merge and send the data out. So that way the data access layer is like pure data access, and I'm not really adding any business logic to that one. So there's a sense of maintaining that if I did that, then anybody can go code that data access layer without even understanding how it can be used. Right? That's the design discussion that you might want to have, whether you want to put that logic here, which means you're doing two queries, or you want to put the logic there, which means you're actually doing one query per se, but the query is what is abstracting out the complexities there for you. So I got my messages. What's my next step? Then I can do multiple send messages.
Launch.
Right?
Yeah.
No, sequences. Can I send message now?
Launch a user or launch a conversation. I don't know what you want.
There's no launching of conversation.
Yes,
Send message to the user then.
Whom do I send it to?
The user ID that.
How do I know
So
the
you
user
want to
ID?
know all the users.
Get the list of.
That's the sixth step, right?
List of contacts.
So since we assume that it's an public open list or something like that, you get a list of every user, that's it. So I need to have a get users list. But if you had a get friend list or something else, this might actually take in the user ID as a parameter or something, and then it will essentially get you only the child of that current user. And where will this come from?
User manager.
So the user manager has a list capability anyways, right? So that's where it will come from.
I think the second and third function should have a relation with each other because the messages will belong to a user, right? So every user will have, so once you get the messages, so those messages will be belonging to some user IDs in the list.
So conversation with you and I, whom does it belong to?
So I can have multiple conversations like with you or someone.
I understand, but I am having a conversation with you. Who owns that message? Does the sender own the message, the recipient own the message, or both of us own the message?
Both.
If both of us own the message, then there's no single ownership.
It's not more of ownership, but maybe visibility. It is visible only to you and him, and not everyone else.
Correct. So that is actually handled by our system, right? The data hiding aspect of it is managed by our system. We are only retrieving messages where I am the sender. We are only retrieving messages where I am the recipient to show data to me. The one question that you might want to have is, why do I have to have this my ID at all? Because if I have a login session, like you implicitly know what the ID is, right? Whoever is calling me, there is some sort of authorization, like authorization and access control somehow enabled, so I will know who is calling me. And when you say get messages, I should automatically know who. I know it's you calling me. I know it's you calling me. So it does. You don't have to tell me the ID. It would be a question that you may get asked, but it's more around saying, I want to define my chat server in a session agnostic way, and there is another layer on top which could populate that user ID automatically or something like that. So there's a different. That goes more into the actual elements of how you design that system. So I got the users list. Will it take a user ID as parameter? Like maybe, maybe not. The user ID, because if you want to do a friends list or restricted list or something like that, you may want to do that, but right now there is no opportunity to do that. That's a potential extension. What else?
So this get user, that's for your client to get the list of users.
Correct.
If you want to display or something.
Not just to display, to send. If I have to send message to you, I need to know what your user ID is. I don't know
That's
yet.
true, right.
But people tried to send message right now and they couldn't because they didn't know who you were. So then that's why he said, oh, hey, we need to get the list of users. So we got the users now. So now that you have a list of users, the UI will show the list of users. You go pick a user and say, I want to send you a message. And then what happens? What's that thing called?
Send message with the user ID.
Send message. And what does it take?
User ID and
Send the
text
message. The receiver ID and the message.
Well, so, can someone answer louder?
The user ID.
Do you need a user ID?
To whom you want to send to.
The message already contains that. Message object already contains
Only
all.
message. Only message object.
And the message. Either we can take whole message object or we can just send the recipient and text and let
Yeah, you're gonna.
the chat server data message and figure out.
The question is, are you gonna let people build message objects externally?
So, and that is is it an OO conversation or is it a system design conversation or what conversation is it? It's OO conversation because the responsibility of who is responsible for what. So OO, principles of OO is all about who owns what property, who is responsible for what operation, like where do you encapsulate that particular activity. So these are all OO conversations. So you could do one or two things in send message. I could independently retrieve the recipient ID, the text ID, the text data. So those are two things I need. And then all I will do under the send message is to construct a message, and then which will automatically populate the sender ID because I know who you are, and then automatically populate the timestamp because I know when you sent it, and then generate the ID because the unique identifier, and then move it along. So I could do that. Or I could expect the client who's calling me somehow to do all that construction thing before and then send me a message and I can just take it on forward. What would you prefer?
I think the first one.
Client the wrapper and sending the chat.
So you would prefer the client doing the packaging and
I guess it'd be a
so
combination.
you would prefer. So option one is essentially send me a message object. Option two is essentially to do the recipient command text. Okay. So option one, few of us in option one camp, few of us in anyone option two camp. Why? So
who will call this function send message? There has to be an entity which is calling.
Yeah, the client will call
the client.
Mhm. So if you did this over like if chat server were to be a RESTful client, this will most likely be like a post on the message resource. So you will be creating all the components of it anyways. So whether you're sending two parameters and expecting the rest of the parameters to be inferred, or whether you're sending the entire message object is kind of the question.
You want the client to have to know as little as possible.
So a few things actually bother me with this on both directions as well. One is essentially the timestamp. What is a timestamp? I don't want the client to be able to bunch the timestamp. I don't want you to backdate your message. I don't want you to future date your message. I want to be the authority on the timestamp of when the message was sent. So that's one thing. But on the other hand, if you're offline and you sent a message at 4 p.m. and you connected at 6 p.m. and then you passed the message at 6 p.m. to the chat server, I would like to preserve originally when you wanted to send it. Right? So my client, the mobile phone client or whatever that is, if you have networking gaps there, my mobile phone client will record the fact that you tried to send the message at 4 p.m. And then whenever the server syncs, the object will sync and everything is golden, right?
So there's a message, that should have more timestamps on, like maybe sent, received by server.
So I would try to fix that problem by actually adding more parameters here as to when was it originally sent and when was it actually captured with the server as different elements. So the timestamp of capture is purely the timestamp of when the server got it, not when the user sent it. So with that definition in mind, I don't think the client should do anything with it. It should only be the server doing that. So if you go with that definition, I think 2 clearly wins because it simplifies the conversation communication between the client and the server. But there are a bunch of things you can do on top of that. At the end of the day, it's not really too different. The concept of adding or enriching the incoming message with additional data that you can add to it as appropriately as you can is a standard design pattern. So there's enriching of data that happens. So that is on this one. Okay. So that's on send message. What else do you need?
Is there really need to send the timestamp when the server is receiving? From the client side, suppose I sent the message, server was offline, right? so I have 3 o'clock and server is up at 6 o'clock. So do we need to send both the timestamps?
If you need that, then there will probably be a message
What is the
sent
need?
timestamp. This message was sent at 4 p.m. or something would be a message sent at, which is more like a customer declared entity, and that would be also required here.
But what is the need of that? Is it really required?
What is the need of that is because the retrieval APIs will actually say get me messages after a timestamp, right? So that this timestamp is actually the time. This will be a server timestamp. Because what happens is that like you came in online, you and I are chatting. You came online at 5 p.m. You retrieved all your messages and you went offline. Okay. Now I go and say I want to send a message at 4 p.m. and that message actually went to the server only at 6 p.m. When you come back at 7, you want to see the message I sent, right? But you won't get it if the query is all based on the arbitrary send timestamp, right? It doesn't make sense. So you want the system to have a very clean view of that. It's a very small nuance, but that's why I would like to keep a server timestamp, and all communication has to be based on server timestamp. The display can be based on what the customer sent and whatever it is, right? So that is something that is that's okay. Like even to some extent, the sending user can potentially be. You can say whoever you are. It can be sent on behalf of, or something else. I mean, in emails, you could actually say foo sent on behalf of bar. You can do that as well. So those things are possible. So you don't have to necessarily assume that the sender is actually known. Just because you sent it doesn't mean it's you. You could send it on behalf of somebody else as well if you want to. More complications there. So there's an element of what is declared data and what is inferred data, right? So that distinction is what is important. So, done with send message. What else we need?
We have a create user. Do we want to have a delete user also? Or there is no concept?
Sure. So there is more, like you can expose all of the user management features through the chat server if you need to, or you can actually ask the customers to directly call the user manager, independent of this. Then you don't need these user management. So we are looking at chat server as a facade, right? Again, hint, hint, another design pattern right there. In case it is not obvious, the chat server is a facade which actually protects everything behind the scenes. So you're not providing direct access to user manager, but you're providing controlled restricted access. So a user can delete himself, for example, but cannot delete some other user, whereas user manager can delete any arbitrary user, as long as you provide. So you need to protect the user manager anyways. Alright, so what else? Let's say send. So yes, I heard you. I think we need to expose a bunch of user manager functionality. You may need to expose a bunch of message store files, the data access layer functionality. What else?
Receive message.
Say again?
Receive message.
Receive message. How would receive message work?
So, if you just send those messages, if those were saved now in the client side, it's supposed to receive the message.
Would that not be get my messages? So get all my messages, is that not the receive? Like if you send me a message, when I go next time and say get all the messages from the last time I talked to you, not you, talk to the server will give me all the messages. It will give you the message you sent, it will give you the message he sent, it will give you the message he sent, and so on, right? And imagine this were to be multi-client, like I am logged in from multiple clients. If I actually sent a message from a different client, and when I hear from here, when I say get all my messages, it will also retrieve not only a message that you have sent me, it will also get the message that I sent to somebody else using a different interface.
So here, as a client outside of the chat server, it's client responsibility to build the conversation loop.
Expectation is that at this point of time. Simple chat server, there's nothing more complicated than that, right? In an interview setting, this is about the depth that you might be able to go to. Now, at this point of time, you may actually jump in and say there are a couple of things that I might want to do. Like, how do I actually, now I want to add read notification. How do I do that? How do I do read notifications? So before I go there, right? So this is it from a design. This is all I would expect in a 45-minute interview. This is where we will be. We will probably reach here anywhere between the 30-minute to 40-minute mark. If you're super good, super fast in terms of communication, we are like, knocking everything out of the park. We will be here. We would have discussed all of these things. We would have hit some parts of it. So now what I want to do is, before we get to the next phase, let me do a few things, just walk through a few things. So number one is abstraction. Did we figure that out here? let's apply the. We're done with the design, all right? And we think it's a good design. Collectively, we think it's a good design. But let's see how do we score, right? Objective evaluation.
Encapsulation is fair because we did those things, right?
What is encapsulation?
I mean, hiding the data behind for each object.
Encapsulation is actually kind of just modeling the data entities at the right level, hiding the data from wherever it is not necessary, and figuring that out.
Also, data plus is more data plus behavior in the same object. But that's the primary.
And data plus the behavior. So we have actually we did delegate some parts of the behavior out of the object. So user does not have any behavior. Only user manager has a behavior. So we've done that. It's, as an entity put together, I think I'm going to call this done. Okay?
At this point in the interview, does it matter whether you're like language specific, like you do this in different ways in different languages, right? To private or final or static, depending on what languages you're using. Is that important?
Language is not as relevant as the construct in terms of like, is there inheritance in play?
Okay.
So
the implementation piece of it isn't
not yet, not yet, and that is the O design should not need that.
Okay.
Based on my understanding, I don't think the language implementation will not leak into your O design.
Okay. But you don't need to speak to that at this stage, right?
Not at this stage, not yet. So what else did we do? We got 1 out of 4 right now.
I think abstraction also is fair because the chat server kind of abstracts what's going behind, right? Like when the way you're getting your messages, you just say we get message. You don't care about dealing with the dial or the user access. Maybe did that.
Okay. Let's assume you got abstraction. The reason why you got abstraction also is that even this whole concept of having a data access layer, having a user manager, these are all like ways of abstracting the functionality out of you're isolating the behavior from the entity. And should I call it the design pattern is also a plus? We got a manager pattern going, we got a data abstraction layer going, we got a facade going. So I think it's probably plus for design pattern at this point. And inheritance and polymorphism.
We have used composition in the series, so I think composition would nullify the inheritance requirement here, I believe.
Yeah, I don't think we need it. I would argue that we don't need inheritance or polymorphism.
So, okay. So let me repeat the dilemma. As an interviewer, as a candidate, your goal is to kind of let the interviewer know that you know everything that is there to be known about object-oriented design, right? You understand inheritance and you understand polymorphism, you understand encapsulation, you understand like all of it, and you can seamlessly apply that to the right problem in the right way. So we haven't touched the inheritance at all in this case. We haven't had any conversation about inheritance, and we have not even said like, hey, inheritance doesn't apply here. I don't have to inherit this. I'm just trying to see if there is any logical inheritance that I can do, but I don't think it's necessary. We have done this. So what we have done actually completely obviates a need for it. The only place where you might want to have inheritance, if at all, and this is where your question comes in handy, is I can actually put an inheritance on my message thing and saying have it an abstract message and then do that. So I would not ask that as a question in the beginning and then use that as an option saying if I had to support multiple types, this would be an abstract message with the following things at the top layer, and the text could be a text message in the child and graphic. That may not be how I implement it. I might actually, most video for like image messages also contain a text component to it. So it's not like they're implemented that way. So I will probably have a text data, video data, media data as a list, and I can call it a day. That's what I'll probably do. But in an interview, I'd like to actually explain that thing. I mean that seems like a logical case for me to do, right? So so that is, I would use your data set there. That's one of the things that I was talking about. The second one I had was around. I don't think encryptions can be kind of treated into this one. No, nothing at all. So that's that. Then the next one was around. So inheritance, I think we can do it if we did that. If we didn't do it, we failed in our design at this point there. That doesn't mean it's a terrible design. All it means is that it's not on a scale of 0 to 100. We are losing a few points because we didn't actually poke in inheritance. Doing that, now we have gotten it better. We've done that in hindsight. polymorphism was last thing. Let me finish that and then I'll come back to the question. Polymorphism. How do are we doing polymorphism here? Or Huh?
Most of the time when you have inheritance, you can do polymorphism.
Render yourself, right? So the content render.
But there is no behavior. You have abstracted all the behavior to message store.
So the context, either it's the text or maybe the way it renders itself, or there could be some functionality for.
But we haven't. Okay, fair enough.
Because
So the way you render a message you can demonstrate a behavior difference there. Fair enough.
Or story message. So DAL can polymorph. I mean, depending on if it's a video or text.
So you could
so
have like
different.
an abstraction layer which essentially abstracts not the storage can be the video storage is different from this, so the behavior can be different. It can store it in some place. Like for example, it can probably upload that file to an S3 or something else and then take a pointer to that and store it in the database. So that behavior now storing of the object is like a plain text if it is this, and if it's an image or a video, it actually knows how to do all of that, and you can do that.
Like in get my message, you can add polymorphism. Like whenever you can set some default option of get everything, and we can have one without any parameter.
So we did that as well. We did call it an optional parameter. So there's a little bit of, it's not really polymorphism per se. That is not enough.
It's got to be the same interface for polymorphism. Same interface, different.
Same interface, different behavior. The optional parameters really don't really count as polymorphism, even there's different sets of activities. So this one I'm a little still doubtful, but potentially the message storage is a good example of doing that. So where we are going with this is that I want us to think about the essential, the 5 things that I want to hit, and make sure that we're hitting all the 5 in our activity midway through the design. The challenge is going to be how you're going to stop seamlessly midway in an interview, trying to just quickly evaluate if you've covered all of the aspects and figure out which ones you haven't covered and then find a way to cover those. It's a little hard. Without actually being like, no, I haven't done it. Let me figure out how to do it. You don't want to be that direct with the conversation, but that's exactly what I would be. I'm kind of recommending that in this context. That it might sound a little like convoluted, made up, like you're trying to force fit this, but it's not so. Because what it does is it actually offers the interviewer to probe you on your understanding of inheritance. If you do not understand inheritance properly, and you actually do a terrible job of modeling this inheritance, well, let's assume that you did a poor job of having an abstract message, but you moved every attribute to each of the messages, right? The sender, the recipient, the timestamp, and all of stuff is all like, moved to individual messages. That's what you did. I know you don't understand inheritance. Because I want to ask, like, hey, if sender is there in every damn thing, why is it not up there, right? So by doing that inheritance exercise, you are providing an opportunity for the interviewer and you to have a conversation about a specific topic that gives the interviewer the data and the confidence to say that you understand inheritance, or evaluate you on your actual knowledge of inheritance, whichever way it is, right? So it's not a negative thing to actually kind of retrofit it. The example is meant to be that way, and usually an interviewer's probes and follow-ups and extensions will be with the intent of figuring out like, hey, you haven't done inheritance yet, so let me actually ask you a question that will force you to do inheritance, and let's find out. So that's where it is coming from. That's where good interviewers do, but you don't want to be at the mercy of the goodness of your interviewer. So you want to be leading the interview, right? So that's it. Sorry, your question. Did I get an answer? You said you had a question.
I don't have a.
I was just going to say, I introduced inheritance in a different place when I tried to come up with design.
Please.
And that was, I did not have the constraint of 1 to n messages.
Okay.
And then I would say that in the message model, the recipient is actually another model. And then both user and chat room inherit from recipient.
So the recipient could, so you basically the way you modeled it is like a room could also be a recipient. And that way there is inheritance. Fantastic. So the challenge with it is that depending on, so that was a good one. So I picked the mediator because that sounded super simple and that was obvious and logical, but yeah, I could have picked that as well for the inheritance component. But if I picked that will actually change a lot of the design, so that's why I didn't pick that now. But fantastic. I think that's another way. So you could actually model your recipient as not a user, but as more like an abstract message target, which could be either a user or a room, and that's fine.
I think the most important thing for inheritance is to remember that derived objects have to be the same derived object for the whole life of the object. That's how you get into trouble with inheritance, and the book does this too. The book is bad about this too. Actually, it does derivations where suddenly if an object is this derived class, and then it can change to this derived class, you've got a problem with that.
No, totally. All right, so with this done, I think we are so assuming that we did the message storage in a polymorphic way, right? So we got that going. I think we have covered all the aspects of it. We have demonstrated that we understand the problem space. We have demonstrated all of that. I think this, to me, would get us reasonably close to sort of like, an outstanding-ish performance. This is how I would look at it.
I have two questions. So there for send message, we thought about option 1 and option 2. So the reason we eliminated option 1 was that we don't want the user tampering with the timestamp.
Correct.
Right. So, but then if you're forced to share that particular initial message timestamp, that is shared by the user itself, right? In
Correct.
option 2 also.
Correct.
So then that tampering of that also could be possible.
So how Facebook does for posts, right, is that it actually shares both the information with the client. So I can backdate a post. I can post something and I can say, I want this post to reflect as if it was like 15th of March. And it will show 15th of March everywhere for everyone. But if you go to the message and you can actually see the details, like was posted on this date. So it lets you do that. On the other hand, there's also like scheduling a post for the future. Is also a scenario where it says that, hey, this post was scheduled on the 15th of March for 31st and it'll only start showing up on 31st. So they do that. So there's a little bit of transparency there, but the expectation is that the behavior makes sense, right? Because I would like to know when did you say what you said, right? And as long as it's clear that it's a declared entity and not a derived entity, I'm fine with that data. And as a customer, as a client, I'm fine with it. I mean, there's an implicit trust element there. If you said that I'm just leaving work, and you send it to your friend, and they expect to see you in like 45 minutes from after you leave work, right? And the message only arrives 30 minutes later. Now, what does that mean? I'm looking at this and saying, when did you send it? You sent it. You meant to send it at 4. You actually sent it at 4:30 because of timestamp network issues. I expect to see you at 4:45, not 45 minutes from when I got the message, right? So there's an element of why I would need that data. Of course, you can use that to cook data up for other things, which has other things, but then you don't use it.
I mean, when we deal with the timestamp, it is, even though it is the sender's timestamp you want to capture, it is very problematic if you rely on sender's local time, because it can, knowing your name will be different than the actual real time. So I don't know how it will work, but I think most of the time if the chart
I think having the fact, which is the absolute timestamp, is useful, and then having the other pieces is just data. All right.
One last question. So if I had no idea about the manager pattern, so am I supposed to declare that entity? I mean, any entity, something related to the user, and like we listed all the properties. Am I expected to list all the properties of the what I expect that?
If you're not talking about design patterns, if you're not talking through design patterns, then you have to walk through that list. It will take more time, right? So if you have, having it as basically declaring chart server as a facade helps you prevent saying, hey, it's a facade, so a bunch of the user activities are exposed through this as appropriate. That's it. I don't have to talk about all the user properties and everything else. As appropriate, right? Leaves us there. Now, only if you have a specific use case, the integrator can come back and say, walk me through how it's going to work for this. Okay. Then you can just walk through a specific thing and make it work. So the theory is that if you just said this was a facade, then it's much easier for you to simply hand wave some of those things and it's automatic. If you don't know a facade pattern, or if you don't know a manager pattern or a data abstraction layer, your design will actually be a lot more verbose. Because you will be restating the obvious, and you will not be also implementing it in a purist way. You will probably you will implement it as it's optimized for this, not necessarily for this. And feel free to use any. I mean, you could have a user factory instead of a user manager, and that might just work. Then the chat server will do a whole bunch of work on using the user factory to create the user. It will probably do the list and delegation and delete directly instead of actually going through a manager. I think having a manager is a fantastic idea. Not having a message manager and having a message store as a data abstraction layer makes sense because there's more complicated queries as possible here. You don't do complicated queries on user, except like list all users. Right? There's no concept of list all users whose name begin with A. It's not something that you probably do, but you could have a user abstraction layer as well, where you're trying to find all friends who are in the same city, find all friends. You could, as you extend and complicate some of those, you might want to have a different layer there for abstraction. Right? But net of it is that one of the good things is that in this discussion we actually went through all of these items in so many different forms. I think inheritance was the one that didn't surface because almost all opportunities for inheritance were abstracted away from a complexity standpoint in the question itself. So I think it was like the setup was against us all along, so it was difficult for us to do that. So by changing some of those vectors, we were able to get that in. I think we hit all the notes based on that, and I think we also followed this more or less. What do you think is the number 5 your output? Did we get to the right output? What was the expected output? Like a class diagram?
Yeah.
With entities called out, with behaviors called out, and the relationship defined. Is this like a good starting point for someone if someone were to go build an app or a web interface or something? Does it have enough specificity in terms of like clarifying all the ambiguities and making sure that this is like well defined in terms of what should be the case? I think so. So you're good. So
I mean, do you want to get to the next level of detail in the sense that what's the interaction, what's the cardinality of objects? Are those needed?
We implicitly talked about it in some of the conversations in this discussion, but the relationships between entities, like are messages like one-to-one, one-to-many? Do we have a conversation or not? So we talked about those objects. So those conversations are absolutely essential. We need to have those conversations. Like we need a conversation object. If you add a room object, you still need a conversation object. Or like who does the message belong to? Does it belong to the sender, the recipient, or both? In that case, is there even an owner? If you have shared ownership, then there is no ownership. Right? So we talked about ownership. We talked about. We didn't specifically talk about cardinality. That is one thing that we kind of missed out. Typically, in a strong data-oriented, object-oriented design, cardinality comes in a lot more. If it's a system which is actually based on storage of data, retrieval of data, this process, job, batches, and things like that, then the cardinality actually shows up in so many different forms. It's much easier. But otherwise, in a normal system design, what comes up is essentially ownership models come up. Who owns what? Who's responsible for what? That comes up here, and the composition elements also come up. So those are the two things that comes up very clearly in this system. Cardinality, I wish we could find a way to inject it, but I just couldn't immediately think of a good way. We talked about entity relationships. We talked about data relationships, but we didn't have a good one-to-many or any relationship come up. If we had the group chat thing, then I think the cardinality is immediate then. But we did talk about that right off the bat and we knocked it off. So if I were an interviewer and I'm looking for cardinality as a checkbox, I'd probably still check it off because we talked about it and there was reasonable conversation around it. Or I will basically not simplify that as a requirement. I'd keep that in and then force you to actually have that conversation. So that depends on whether that is one of the items that the interviewer wants to focus on. So,
question on the chat server, right? We have a create user and get users list, right?
Mm-hmm.
If chat server, if you're thinking about like single responsibility principle, like shouldn't it handle like create users and get users list, or we should push that responsibility to user manager?
what are we doing here?
On chat server, I would think like it should only like fetch messages and send messages.
So chat server is the facade,
okay,
which actually delegates the responsibility to that. So the why that actually works very well is that then authentication, authorization, access control is all like as long as you secure a chat server, you can deal with other things and add the things below that. Like for example, if you want to do delete user, for example, right? Delete user, I should only be able to delete me. I can't delete you. So for that reason, when you do this, or if I do delete message, right, I should be only able to delete messages that are that I sent or I don't want to see. But that should not delete the message for you. Like if you and I had a chat, I delete the message, then we need to think of what that means. Are we deleting the message or are we deleting the message for me? Like, are you hiding the message from the sender or are you hiding the message from the recipient? And that might be just flags here in that particular scenario. So there is some access control that you want to build in, and that will be built in as a part of the chat server layer. So I would recommend this being a facade which actually offers like the superset of all functionality that will be exposed to the client device or client server, client system. Okay? All right, we have about 30 more minutes before we need to close everything out. I wanted to touch on at least one of the other, I think it was Minesweeper or something?
I don't think we'll have time to do Minesweeper. Maybe we want to do a simple version of parking lot.
We'll see. All right, go ahead.
So to quantify the needs, do we address the other half of clear five machines with the measure at some point?
Yeah, so we just talked about that earlier, right? So this is just, I just listed them out in an order that I thought was meaningful. So that's why we did it. But the way it works is that there is one clarification which is actually to understand what the objective of the interview is. What do you want? Do you want system design? Do you want me to write code? Do you want me to write O design? What do you want? That is the first level of clarification. Once I'm done with that, I also want to figure out what the classification is. And then there's clarifying based on needs is my third step. So I will want to rewrite this. When I want to write this down as a blog post or something, let me try to find a better way to articulate this. But we just walk through the entire process. So rather than getting hung up on what is written here, I think the process is what we outlined. We went through that process and we spent an inordinate amount of time trying to stay away from entities and behavior, almost to a point where I was actually shutting people down. No, that's a behavior, let's stop, right? Again, the intention was not to cut people off, but actually to start thinking about needs as opposed to behavior and actions, behavior and entities. So we did that. So we should internalize that in any form that's meaningful, and let me write out my thoughts in a blog post or something and post it on Facebook. Once we are done with that, then what we can do is feel free to comment and feel free to disagree, because a lot of this thing is opinion driven. 10 people will have 20 opinions. That's the nature of the space. So feel free to comment, feel free to criticize specific areas, and then I can go back and re-articulate what I was thinking in it. All right. So anyway, I think actually parking lot is something that I don't want to do because we just went through some parts of parking lot as a part of the initial setup, so it's fine. And Minesweeper is probably a little too big for this activity. So let's continue conversations about general interview questions, another 15 minutes or so, and then we can wind up. So any questions on the how we went through this? Any insights into what part of it is something that was surprising for you, or if you didn't do this today, right? What would you have done differently? Or what would you do differently now that we went through the session? Like, what part of this entire conversation was meaningful, did it make sense, was against what you were thinking? Some highlights of, because I'm just trying to see what people are internalizing from this session.
Does the UML representation is essential when boarding the solution?
I don't know, but I've seen this representation help.
So from an interviewer's perspective, is this sufficient, or do they expect more formal UML notations?
Very rarely. I have not seen people expect that. I don't think people even understand the rational rows elements as much. So the UML is just there. People understand how to interpret it, but they can't even. I don't think I can call out this is not right. You need to put a diamond here and not a triangle or something. I can't say that. I don't even know that. Okay, so I don't know because I've not done it, and I doubt many interviewers will be familiar with that. This structure of representation helps. Like sequence diagram is another format which helps, but the sequence diagram is only useful if I think for an interview sequence diagram is not useful. For design documents, I insist on sequence diagrams because there we are very specific because the entities already exist, behaviors already exist. So I want system 1 to call system 2 with this pattern, I want system 2 to call this, and then I want them to wait, I want them to loop. So that particular piece is something that every design document that I've read has multiple sequence diagram for that. And that specifically captures, it's not just for the objects, but it's more around, that is how we identify bottlenecks, that's how we identify mismatch in data. What happens if this doesn't come back? What do you do, right? So those kind of things come up in sequence diagrams a lot more. So, if I were running an interview and the question was around a chat server, a bunch of the discussion that we had in about 2 hours plus is what I expect to be essentially condensed in a matter of 30 minutes, and that is easily doable because we spent a good 30 minutes on a 5-minute clarification. Right? We spent different flavors of that, so that's 5 minutes of clarification. And then I think we spent more time because we were just trying to do back and forth and trying to question the thought process. It would not take that much time. I think this would be a minimum of 20 minutes, maximum of like 35 minutes in an interview to get to this point, if you want it to be a good interview. So even with the same output, depending on the journey you have taken, it could be a terrible interview as well. Even if you produce the exact same output, but the interviewer had to handhold you, had to guide you to it, and you make incorrect assumptions, you do wrong things, and the interviewer corrects you in certain cases, and then you do the right thing, the output might be still okay, but the process will actually ding you significantly. So if you did everything that we did collectively as an interview community, this would be a pretty reasonably high quality interview. Like the original things I read, right? This is what I would like to write as feedback for someone who's done a good interview. I think if we did all this, we would have done that. The 3 parts, right? You know your OFU, you invented as you went, because we didn't have this thing in our mind. We actually, as we were doing this, we kind of invented. Like this whole user manager, I didn't have it in my mind in the beginning. When someone made a comment, we put it there. The data abstraction layer was sort of an afterthought. We just were evolving the design as we were coming. So that's, to me, that tells me that it is like we did that well. And the problem solving in layers is where I think I have a little bit of a concern because we went user first, message next, and this next, but that's okay. I mean, I think it is a different way of looking at it.
If like in the middle of the design, and let's say if you check those 5 items and you realize you somehow come up with a better design, and do you think that you stick with this one, or you go back to change the design?
You have to have a good way of justifying why you're changing your design.
Let's say like initially like most people would think of like conversation or something, and then we go with that route, and then at a certain point we maybe the hint this for this design, and then you like this might be better, right?
Sure. Again, for the invent and simplify or the innovation element that I was talking about, I think what you need to do is you need to be flexible you need to take the changes in problem statement, be open to changing your design in meaningful ways, or completely trash your design and start fresh if you are actually the fundamental assumptions are violated. So you should be ready for that. Don't be married to your design, and just because you designed it doesn't mean it's the best design. Like digging your heels into it, or like there are a few failure patterns which are very obvious, is where you have a terrible design, which is actually because you're making some assumptions which are wrong, and the interviewer actually confronts you with the design, and you still dig your heels in and say, oh, I can make minor changes to this and make it work, would be a bad idea. Like for example, we did all of this, and now suddenly the interviewer comes and says, you know what, we need conversation for some reason. That's how we do it. Like I need to find a way to archive conversations and store them in some meaningful way, because it's like a legal requirement that I need to archive all conversations, some crap like that. Or I need to archive only those conversations which have the following buzzwords mentioned, for whatever reason. If the moment the word conspiracy comes anywhere in the conversation, I want the entire conversation archived. Now make it happen. Now I need to have like a conversation listener, I need to have like a conversation filter, I need to do all of that to figure out how to do it. So that I need to be able to meaningfully add extension components to current design. And if my current design limits me from doing that, I should have the ability to like completely screw this and say, let me do it again. So be open to that. That's the feedback. And interviewing it's a little hard because there is a little bit of mind reading that is expected there. So you are expected to read the interviewer's mind to figure out where he or she wants to take you, and that's where you need to be testing whether they really are. When you get challenged in your design, the interviewer could be doing one of two things. The interviewer could be actually saying, hey, your design sucks, I want to guide you to a better design. Or the interviewer could say, you know what, I'm not sure if you're convinced about your own design, let me challenge you and see if you like buckle, or you're able to come back, you're able to justify your design. And you don't know which is which, right? I mean, the questions will sound the same. The questions, the pokes are the same, the challenges are the same. So you need to find ways to defend your position while inspecting whether there is a problem with your design. If you understand that there are challenges, like, oh yeah, I think that's right. Let me actually make these changes to make it work. But there has to be that push, the meaningful pushback has to be there, because if you don't do that, you build a design and they come back and say, hey, I think I need conversations. Like, okay, you just built a conversation class is not good. You need to ask, why do you need a conversation class, how it's going to be used, walk through the clarification. just because the interviewer asks you, why don't you have a conversation class, does not mean that the interviewer is expecting you to have a conversation class, right? So it's a little bit of mind reading there. So kind of do that as much as you can to figure out how that works.
So
right?
regarding so mind reading. So let's say the interviewer comes and says, "Hey, design a chat server." Do we straight up ask him like, "Hey, do you want me to design a full system, or do you want me to like come up with the class objects, or do you want me to like write a bit of code as well?" Like, do we straight up ask, or do we start asking questions and then he directs us?
So bunch of questions here. So let me take a step back.
Yeah.
And I'll have to see if there's a good example of like an interview where this thing is like YouTube has a bunch of videos where they do this, so you may be able to find this. So when someone comes, if I were the candidate and you're an interviewer, you're saying, "Hey, Vivek, go design a chat server," I'm like, chat server, so something like Facebook Messenger, WhatsApp, and these things. I've used a bunch of chat servers, so something like that. Is that what you're looking for? Like, yes, that's what I'm looking for. Alright, so a bunch of components there. I can see client, I can see the UI, I can see design, I can see data, with different angles of it. So which ones you want me to focus on first? So I've defined all of these things. So what do you want? Which area do you want to focus on? Like, let's focus on the middle tier, which is like the chat server, the core chat server. That's what I want you to design. Forget about the UI for now. Forget about storage. Okay. Like, okay, fantastic. Now for this, like, are we looking at figuring out the like scale, system aspects of it, or do you want me to design the object model? That may be a very. If the question were to be posed as this, I would just assume, not class classification. I would just assume it's a system design.
Right.
Okay. But if the interviewer has clearly said it's OO design, then I think then I don't know. It's a UI OO or is it a OO for this, right? So I would actually clarify whether it's OO or for the UI or for the backend, and then it will probably be the backend. Then you can just go to whatever. So I would. It's not easy. So it is not. It is never easy. I mean, and I don't think we'll get it right even. So we just have to give it a shot. Ask the right questions. Hope that the questions actually get us where it is. The first, one of the other things in an interview is that interviewers suffer from both primacy and recency. Primacy is essentially the first impression that you make. All right. So the kind of questions that you ask, the kind of logical structure that you're thinking is important. So when someone actually says, "Go design like a parking lot for me," and like, "Oh, not again," is even though that's what you might feel, you might not want to share that. It's like, "Oh yeah, parking lot, right? So what kind of parking lot?" I mean, the more excitement you can show, the more connectedness you can show, the more you can say, like, "Yes, I have used a bunch of chat servers in different ways. I've done IRC back in those days," and the more connections you can make about with like real world systems, so like an airline reservation, like like how we book flights on this, or do you want a website, do you want the client? So explaining the familiarity that you have will actually go a long way, and it's for any question. So that's one thing. So it's a primacy effect. The recency effect is essentially what you leave the impression at the end. Right. So once the whole interview is over, no matter how bad you do in the middle, like if you finish with a splash with a bang, it will actually go a long way in actually helping you. So which is one of the reasons why you want to test your design, test your code. You want to make sure that everything is all good, and then you're actually finishing with actually the output and validating that your output has actually matched the needs. Like, did we actually meet the needs of the customer? So we need to talk about that, and then we also need to make sure that we've also met the needs of the interview, which is essentially all of that. It's like basically saying that, so here's what it is. This is an object-oriented design, which actually I think it captures all the key elements of core design, core principles. I might want to find a good way to work that in the conversation. So typical interview pattern. Primacy, recency is like very, very common, and if you like, the first impressions actually are much harder to break, and that changes a lot. But just because if you start terribly, that is not the end of the world. But if you don't start well and you don't end well, the interview is not going to end well anyways. So at least one, if not both, has to be good. Okay. All right. Any other questions? We got like a time for a few more quick questions.
I think one of the scope basically missed in this question, particularly based on the restriction that we imposed is the solid principles. So if I am an interviewer, I would not be able to evaluate my interviewee on how will he improve. I mean, how will he design something, keeping the solid principles.
What are the? Can you help us outline that?
Single responsibility pattern, and then the scope substitution. Always.
Open, closed.
Yeah, open, closed, and the list of substitution and the interface segregation, and then release dependency inversion. So, I mean,
that's actually a good insight. So I have not been thinking about that. So I have modeled my entire conversation around this. So if you as an interviewer have this as a checklist, you would have checked everything off.
Yep.
If you as an interviewer had this, like you need to go from here to there in some kind of different ways, which is different.
Yeah.
If depending on the company I'm interviewing with, depending on the organization that you're with, if you know that they are fans of Solid, and you will actually be able to even figure that out in conversations in various elements, then I would actually scratch the entire thing that we did and have yet another session like this, where we are actually focusing on these designs and then essentially check off each one of them independently. So very good insight. I have not yet in any of my sessions, I haven't covered Solid ever. In the last 8 years we haven't done that. So I would want to read about what those things are and how those things meaningfully manifest. There's a mapping. It's not a complete scratch out. The output might still end up being this or something similar, but the mechanics that we get to, how we approach that will actually change.
Absolutely.
And how we talk about it.
I interviewed with a company a couple weeks ago. In their job description, they had client subscribes to Solid principles. And I had never actually read the Solid principles, believe it or not.
Yeah.
So I read them, and they are a bit controversial. I've seen some bad designs based on the Solid principles, especially like the so-called list-off substitution principle. They're rather, what's the right word? They're rather very strict. Is the word I'm looking for.
It's not new. It's been around for a while.
I know, right?
But unlike OO, from what I understand, OO is not Java post. Right? OO has been there even before that. Object-oriented principles have been there well before that, even though we didn't have a good, meaningful way of expressing it. But I think when I was reading blogs and forums, there are people who are talking about like I've been using OO since '75 or something like that. I'm like, okay, must be that old. The principles exist. I mean, these concepts of abstraction and calculation exist. And I think this is just a different mapping of the same principles in different ways. The goal of the interview for a candidate is not to. The intention is not to design a fantastic system. The intention is to communicate to the interviewer that I understand Solid very well. I understand what S means. I understand how it's applied. I understand what O means. I understand the limitations, and so on. Which we did here, right? We demonstrated that in each of these there was deliberate, methodical thought process around. We had the right thought process, right questioning. We went through that. The same thing would be expected of here. I don't have enough understanding of these principles yet for me to have a I can't the way I can do this from memory. I don't even understand what this is. Like I couldn't even listen.
I think
you're going to read.
This is more like a system architecture level question. It would not be directly mapped into the old design question.
So it's a behavior. It's a behavior based design, right?
Yeah.
So the basically for all questions around behavior.
Yes.
And roles and responsibilities. From what I understand vaguely about what Solid principles were, those are the ones where I can demonstrate that. And all I have to do is every time I do that, I need to go map every statement I say has to be. If you should be able to take that and file it under S. You should be able to take that and file it under O. Right? If you could do that, then I'm already building my corpus of yes for S, yes for O, and everything else.
I think the Solid principles are really, a lot of them are based heavily on inheritance, which is
behavior isolation.
Not used as much as it used to be. Inheritance, because we have client server now, you don't use inheritance as much as you used to, in my opinion. So the Solid principles, in my opinion, have gotten a little stale.
And the other one is the data-driven design, right?
Yes.
Which is the other one, which is we're nowhere near that.
I think Robert Martin, Uncle Bob, he actually took data-driven design and then he kind of simplified it and then he came up with the Solid principles.
Okay.
That's how he kind of articulated. He has written a good book called as Clean Architecture, which has the first section of the book talks about this.
Here's another thing. Of course, when you are playing to an audience. So if your interviewer wants you to do Solid principles, I don't care what your fundamental convictions are. Go do Solid. If your interviewer wants design principles, I don't care where your convictions are. Go do this, right? I mean, to some extent, that's what you're trying to get to. Even if you're if you could do data-driven design a lot more effectively, and that's probably what is right here. It might work because in many cases people do walk in with an object-oriented design in mind. I mean, that's what I want to evaluate. And I provide a question and the candidate comes back with like a fantastic, I think now I saw like the last 3 or 4 design interviews I had, everything revolves around like Kafka and queues and data and like back in those days it was TIBCO, but now it's all messaging bus and everything. Yeah, so I see all of that. So now when I see these things, right, I throw away my rubric that I have for evaluation, and I now have to kind of infer the rubric based on what it is. So my decision is not as rigorous as it was. Like if it was this, I know where you are. I know you are at a 10 percentile, 50 percentile, or 90 percentile based on my previous background. But now you come up with a completely new design that kind of baffles me. You have, if it's a good interviewer, you might find someone who's willing to throw away their old rubric, come up with a new one, and then also be willing to examine, like maybe my assessment is not perfect, so I'm going to go with something, no conviction one way or the other, and use proxies to evaluate and things like that. Or you may find a bad interviewer saying, oh, the guy doesn't know anything about, screw it, right? Anything is possible. And so I don't know what is the right thing to do. My recommendation would be to go play to what your audience wants. And understand how O works, understand how solid works, understand data-driven design, and all of those, and then try to work through those. All right? All right, any other questions?
So if you have time later on, maybe you can get into, in the interview, get into, I guess, the whole Kafka and other things, trying to see how you can scale this out or put an actual system architecture.
So those things usually fall under the system design category,
right.
Because usually we are trying to look at that's more for scale, it's more for it's more for like trying to figure out like how do you get near real-time messages or permanency, retrieval, and all that stuff, right? Storage.
Correct.
So we wouldn't do much of that. All right. So thank you everyone, and what we'll do next class is probably online. So just check. We'll continue with our the cracking the coding interview for the question. All right. Thank you. A couple of people took pictures. I'm going to ask them to post.